The mist rises in August, as it has for centuries, over the rolling farmland of Normandy. The sky is the color of slate, and the air holds that particular dampness that comes just before dawn, thick enough to settle on your skin, cool enough to remind you that summer is already beginning its slow retreat into memory. Somewhere beyond the apple orchards, a crow calls out, its voice carrying unevenly through the fog, and then falls silent, leaving only the sound of moisture dripping from the leaves of the hedgerows onto the dark, rich soil below. If you were standing in a field just outside the town of Falaise on an August morning in 1944, this is what you would have heard and felt: the quiet, the waiting, the way the world seems smaller in the mist, as though all of history has contracted to the space between two hedgerows, and what happens next will determine the fate of armies. This landscape has a particular character, the bocage, as the French call it, a patchwork of small fields enclosed by dense, high hedges and ancient sunken lanes that have been deepened by centuries of cart traffic and running water. It is, to the eye of a soldier approaching from the outside, almost maze-like. To those who know it, it feels like home. To those who do not, it becomes a trap. The history of the Second World War has many graves. Some are marked, some are not. But if you were to ask military historians across the world where the German Panzer Divisions, and in particular the elite armoured formations of the Waffen-SS, were broken as a fighting force in Western Europe, most would point you toward this very landscape, toward Falaise, toward the final weeks of August 1944, a moment in time that lasted only days, but whose consequences echoed through the rest of the war and into the calculations of the modern world. It is the story of a pocket, a trap that slowly closed around some of the most feared and formidable military units ever assembled. It is the story of how ideological commitment, tactical courage, and mechanical excellence were outmatched by strategy, numbers, and the realities of modern warfare waged from the air. If you've ever wondered how the most elite armored divisions in Hitler's Wehrmacht, the divisions that had rampaged across Russia, that had held against the Soviets year after year, that arrived in Normandy with a reputation that made even seasoned Allied commanders pause, could find themselves surrounded and broken in the span of just over 2 weeks, this is the documentary that will walk you through every stage of their destruction. We'll begin at their creation, trace their path through triumph and expansion, witness the moment they were committed to a battle they could not win, and finally, we'll stand with them as the pocket tightened and the world closed in. If this journey through one of World War II's most decisive military victories interests you, please subscribe to Fall Asleep 2, where we explore the complete histories that shaped the modern world, one long, gentle documentary at a time. The morning mist we began with, that particular quality of Normandy light and air in the early hours, existed on both sides of what was about to unfold. German panzer crews, buttoned up in their tanks in hastily prepared positions, experienced it the same way. So did the American soldiers in their camps not far away. So did the Canadian regiments moving up from the bridgeheads. Weather does not recognize borders or ideologies. It simply is. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, when the great storm that had been gathering for months finally broke across the Norman coast, that same mist, that same dampness, hung over beaches where the invasion would begin, and over the countryside where the SS Panzer Divisions would begin their race toward a destiny they did not yet understand. But to understand Falaise, we must first understand the divisions themselves, how they came to be, what they believed they were, the particular alchemy of idealism and violence that had transformed a ceremonial guard unit into something far more dangerous. The SS Panzer Divisions were not born out of normal military tradition. They were forged, deliberately and methodically, as instruments of an ideology. Their soldiers were volunteers in the truest sense. They believed in something, though what they believed in and why, and what that belief cost them and the world is a question that will shadow every moment of this narrative. The light is beginning to break through the mist now. In the far distance, we might imagine the sound of engines, though that is getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let us remain in this quiet moment, in the cold dawn air, in the orchards and hedgerows of Normandy, and begin our story at the beginning. Let us understand what these divisions were before we witness their ending. And yet, there exists a place in Normandy, a region of rolling pasture and small villages, with names like Trun and Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, where the greatest armoured force Hitler ever assembled would be systematically crushed within the span of mere weeks in August of 1944. A place that French and Polish historians have long called the grave of the SS Panzer Divisions, the moment when the armour that had terrified Europe for years was finally broken, not by a single dramatic blow, but by the patient, grinding geometry of a closing trap. How is it possible, you might wonder, that the elite mechanized units that had swept across the Soviet steppes with seeming invincibility, that had held their own in the first desperate weeks after D-Day, could be reduced from formidable fighting forces to scattered remnants and burning wreckage in such a compressed span of time? The answer lies not in a single battle, but in a cascade of decisions, some made by Hitler thousands of kilometers away, others made by field commanders desperate to salvage what they could from an increasingly hopeless situation. It lies in the nature of modern warfare itself, where air superiority compounds every mistake, where a trapped army has nowhere to retreat, and where geography becomes as lethal as any weapon. The Falaise Pocket, as historians came to call it, would claim the organized existence of nearly a dozen major German formations, and among them the SS Panzer Divisions, the ideological vanguard, the shock troops, the elite of the Nazi regime's military machine, would suffer wounds from which they would never fully recover in the Western theatre. Some 70,000 German soldiers would be captured or killed. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, guns and trucks would be left smouldering in the Norman fields. And the myth of German invincibility, already frayed by years of war, would be torn completely open. What makes this history worth understanding is not merely the spectacle of destruction, but the human dimensions beneath it. These were men, young men, many of them, conscripted or committed to an ideology they had been shaped by since childhood, trapped in a situation that grew worse by the hour. They were commanded by officers who sometimes still believed in victory, sometimes in orderly withdrawal, and sometimes in nothing but survival. They faced not just the overwhelming firepower of the Allies, but the collapse of the very command structure that held them together. And they did all of this in a landscape that offered them no shelter, no escape route that remained open for long, no mercy. Over the hours and days ahead, we will trace how these divisions came to be. We will walk through their creation in the pre-war years, their transformation from ceremonial guards into the hardest fighting units on any front. We will move through their victories and their slow, grinding exhaustion as they faced Allied strength they could not overcome. We will experience the weeks of June and July when SS Panzer crews fought in the bocage, those dense hedgerow mazes of Normandy where visibility was measured in meters and every field could hide anti-tank guns. And then we will step carefully into the August days when the pocket tightened, when roads became killing grounds, when the dream of breaking out or holding a line became impossible. This is a history of how military power, no matter how fearsome, can be undone by circumstance, by strategic overreach, by the laws of mathematics and supply lines and terrain. It is a history of the men inside the tanks and the men giving orders from bunkers. It is a history of what happens when an army realizes, perhaps too late, that the war it hoped to win has already been lost. And if you wish to journey with us through this story, to understand not just what happened at Falaise, but how it happened and what it meant for the course of the war and for the thousands of lives it touched. We would be honored to have you subscribe to this exploration of one of the Second World War's most pivotal and most terrible moments. The countryside around us grows quieter now. The mist still lingers in the orchards and over the distant fields, but 2,000 kilometers to the east and 25 centuries back through time, other men were being forged, men who would one day march westward toward these very Norman fields, unaware that their destiny lay not in conquest, but in a trap they would not see closing until it was far too late to escape. Before the panzer formations that would burn and die in the Norman bocage could exist, they had to be imagined, and long before imagination comes ideology, that slow-moving river that shapes nations and wars, that decides which men will wear which uniforms and why. The Waffen-SS itself was born not as a military force, but as an idea wearing black uniforms. In the late 1920s, as the Weimar Republic struggled in its final gasping years, the Nazi Party created the Schutzstaffel, the protection squadron, as a personal bodyguard unit. They were meant to be ceremonial, ideological, untouchable. They carried the party's most fervent believers, those who understood themselves as the vanguard of something epochal. For years, that was all they were, men in dress blacks, marching in torchlit rallies, embodying a vision rather than projecting actual power. But visions can transform. In the early 1930s, as Hitler consolidated control, the SS began to expand in ways that surprised even some of its own commanders. What had been a ceremonial guard became a state within a state. Intelligence organs, concentration camp guards, ideological enforcers. The leadership saw that they could build something more. A military force that answered to the party first, to Germany second, a pure expression of Nazi ideology, armed with modern weapons. By the mid-1930s, the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, as distinguished from the administrative SS, began recruiting and training in earnest. They sought young men of particular stock, those who met strict racial and physical criteria. Do you wonder what made them believe such criteria mattered? The ideology demanded it. Purity of blood, they believed, would translate somehow into purity of purpose, into fighting spirit, into the ability to wage the kind of total war that was coming. Whether this belief had any rational foundation was irrelevant. What mattered was that they organized their military structure around it. The early formations were infantry regiments, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Deutschland, the Germania. They were small, intensely trained, ideologically homogeneous. They carried the party's racial obsessions and the party's absolute standards into the field, and initially they were questionable soldiers, well-motivated certainly, brave, sometimes recklessly so, but they lacked the depth of training, the careful, methodical approach that the professional German army, the Heer, cultivated over centuries. Where the army valued experience and tradition, the SS valued purity and revolutionary fervor. What changed everything was the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a military campaign. It was, in the Nazi imagination, a racial and ideological war of annihilation. And suddenly, the Waffen-SS found itself at the tip of the spear, not marching in parades, but fighting in forests and steppes against enemies they had been told were existential threats. They suffered enormous casualties. They also, by all contemporary accounts, fought with extraordinary ferocity. The Soviet campaign burnished the SS's reputation and justified its expansion. By 1943, senior Nazi leadership decided that the SS should have armored formations of its own. The Heer had panzer corps and armies with centuries of cavalry tradition behind them. But the SS wanted its own panzer divisions, commanded by SS officers, crewed by SS men, answering to SS hierarchy rather than the regular chain of command. And so the decision was made. The first true SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was formally converted from a motorized infantry division into an armored formation in 1943. Think of that transformation for a moment. The men who had been Hitler's personal guards, who had stood at attention in Berlin beer halls, would now command Tiger tanks and Panther tanks, the most advanced and formidable armor that Germany could produce. They would receive disproportionate allocations of equipment, supplies, and replacement troops. The party, even as the war turned against it, lavished resources on the SS Panzer Divisions because they represented something essential to Nazi ideology, the triumph of will and race over material disadvantage. Other divisions followed. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, formerly Das Reich Motorized, received its armor. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg were created virtually from scratch, assembled from cadres of experienced men and eager young recruits, equipped with the latest armor and sent eastward to stem the Soviet advance. By 1944, there were 6 full SS Panzer divisions in existence, with more planned. What's worth noting, if we pause to reflect, is that these formations were almost uniquely expensive in a war Germany was losing. A single panzer division required enormous resources: ammunition, fuel, replacement crews, spare parts. The Heer was increasingly starved for such things, forced to make do with obsolete equipment and undertrained replacements. But the SS divisions, they were the darlings of the Nazi system. They got what they asked for. They got the newest tanks. They got the best junior officers. They got the propaganda value that came with belonging to the elite branch of the regime. The men within these divisions came from varied backgrounds, though propaganda always spoke of them as racial and ideological paragons. Some were true believers, young men who had absorbed Nazi ideology from childhood and saw service as a sacred duty. Others were drawn by the prestige, the knowledge that SS units were considered the best. Still others were conscripts, pulled in as replacements as the war progressed. And as losses mounted on the Eastern Front, the SS divisions were forced to recruit outside their strict racial criteria, taking in men from occupied territories, men whose commitment to Nazi ideology could at best be described as questionable. Yet the myth endured. The Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions, in the eyes of both Allied soldiers and German High Command, were the most formidable formations Germany possessed. They were imagined as invulnerable, unstoppable, the pure expression of Nazi military power. When Hitler decided to redirect them westward in the spring of 1944, to position them behind the Atlantic Wall in preparation for the inevitable American invasion, the assumption was that they would crush any beachhead, any Allied thrust, with the same ferocity they had shown in the East. What no one could foresee, what perhaps was unknowable at that moment, was that these divisions, elite, lavishly equipped, steeped in ideology and pride, would within a few months be trapped in a dying countryside, their tanks abandoned or burning, their command structure collapsing, their legend unraveling kilometer by kilometer as they died in a place that would be remembered, in the histories of the war, as their grave. But that end was still far away, for now, in the quiet months before the invasion, they were still the terror of Europe, still the regime's armored fist, and they were about to be sent west to defend the beaches they had never seen. And so these units, born in ceremony and shaped by ideology, would soon find themselves tested on a scale that few military formations had ever experienced. The Eastern Front, that vast and terrible theatre where entire armies would dissolve and reform like smoke, became the forge in which the Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions were hardened into instruments of frightening efficiency. Consider the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the division whose very name carried the weight of the Führer's personal guard. When they first rolled eastward in the summer of 1941 as part of Operation Barbarossa, they were among the best equipped and most fiercely motivated soldiers Germany possessed. The early months brought them rapid victories across Ukrainian wheat fields and into the Caucasus. There is something almost dreamlike in the accounts of those early triumphs, the way contemporaries describe the speed with which they moved, the way their command structure seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they fully materialized. By late 1942, the Leibstandarte had earned a fearsome reputation not only for their combat prowess, but for their willingness to fight in conditions that would have broken lesser formations. Das Reich division, formed later but no less ambitious, carved its own path of dominance across the steppes. Imagine the perspective of a Soviet commander facing them, watching intelligence reports accumulate about this new German formation, with its distinctive insignia and its peculiar combination of tactical brilliance and recklessness. They moved with what historians often describe as almost artistic coordination, their reconnaissance elements probing deep into Soviet territory, their panzers arriving at crucial moments to turn retreating columns into catastrophes. The division developed a culture of aggressive leadership, where junior officers were expected to think independently and seize opportunities without waiting for orders to trickle down from above. Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, the two divisions that came later, were built partly in the image of their predecessors, but also with lessons learned from the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front. When they first entered combat in 1943, they inherited not just equipment and training, but also a certain mystique, a sense that they were part of something historically significant, something that had proven itself in the largest land war the world had ever seen. The training grounds where they assembled, often in occupied Poland or in the forests of the Reich itself, hummed with a kind of grim determination. These were not casual formations. These were units that had been told they were elite, and they had begun to believe it, not through propaganda alone, but through the evidence of their own survival and their own victories. What made these divisions truly fearsome, however, was not simply their equipment or even their ideology. It was something more subtle and more durable, a developing mastery of what modern tacticians would call mobile warfare. The Eastern Front, for all its horrors, had become a school in rapid armoured manoeuvre. The Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and their sister divisions learned to coordinate tanks, motorized infantry, and assault guns in ways that caught their opponents off balance. They developed a language of command that allowed panzer captains, sitting in their turrets behind plate steel, to communicate with motorcycle-mounted reconnaissance teams and self-propelled gun crews spread across kilometers of muddy terrain. How did they manage this coordination in a landscape where radio signals sometimes simply vanished into static and distance? Through practice, repetition, and a willingness to accept casualties as the price of tactical innovation. By 1943, these divisions had absorbed and executed some of the most sophisticated combined arms operations of the war. At Kursk, that vast tank engagement in the summer of 1943, they faced off against mechanically superior Soviet armor and prevailed through superior coordination and unit cohesion. The numbers are staggering when one pauses to consider them. Panther tanks and Tigers rolling across the Russian steppe, and yet it was the discipline of the formations around them, the way assault guns protected flanks, the way infantry dug in to hold terrain while panzers maneuvered, that gave these divisions their cutting edge. There grew around them, inevitably, a reputation that preceded them. Soviet commanders began to request additional resources when intelligence confirmed that SS Panzer Divisions were being moved to their sector. Wehrmacht officers, those from the traditional army, sometimes observed these divisions with a mixture of admiration and wariness. They were effective, undeniably so. But they were also unpredictable, sometimes taking risks that seemed reckless, sometimes pushing operations further than conventional military logic would have dictated. Some of this came from their ideological motivation, yes, but some of it also came from the simple fact that they were young, that they had tasted victory, and that they believed themselves to be invincible. The casualty figures tell a darker story, of course, one that would only become fully visible later. For every triumph on the Eastern Front, there was a loss. Soldiers frozen in abandoned positions, entire platoons absorbed into the endless grinding of attrition, villages captured and recaptured and captured again. The divisions rebuilt themselves constantly, drawing new recruits from a shrinking pool of German manpower, training them in days or weeks rather than months, and then committing them to lines where Soviet artillery could thin their ranks almost mechanically. Yet the mystique remained. Somehow, these units survived. Somehow they continued to function as cohesive fighting forces, even as other German formations collapsed into chaos around them. By the time the war's center of gravity began to shift westward, by the time Hitler's eyes turned toward France and the anticipated Anglo-American invasion, the Leibstandarte, das Reich, Hohenstaufen, and Frundsberg carried with them something invaluable: the confidence of men who had fought in history's greatest land war and had not merely survived, but had excelled. They were not undefeated exactly, but they were unbowed. They had learned to read terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, to orchestrate violence on a scale that few military formations in history had achieved. When orders came to redeploy westward, to garrison Normandy and prepare for the invasion that everyone knew was coming, these divisions did not go as defeated men. They went as the elite of Hitler's military machine, as the final instrument by which he believed he could yet turn the tide of war. How wrong they would prove to be, how catastrophically wrong, lay hidden still in the future, waiting in the Normandy blockade and the encircling fields around a small medieval town called Falaise. By the winter of 1943, the High Command knew what was coming. The Wehrmacht's generals, even those who still believed in victory, understood that the Allies would not wait forever. Across occupied France, along the Norman coast, and Brittany and the Channel shores, vast fortifications were rising. Pillboxes of reinforced concrete, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire strung in geometric patterns across beaches and meadows. It was Field Marshal Rommel's vision, this Atlantic wall, and though it would never be complete, it was growing teeth. And deeper inland, in the quiet forests and behind the stone walls of Norman farmland, the German army was gathering its reserve armor, readying for the blow it felt certain would come. The SS Panzer Divisions, those hardened veterans of Russia, began their slow migration westward in the early months of 1944. They came not as occupying forces now, but as a strategic reserve. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich moved first, its columns of Tiger and Panther tanks rolling through the winter countryside, leaving the endless steppes behind. The 1st SS Panzer Corps Leibstandarte, pride of the SS Armored Arm, would follow. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, divisions formed more recently but blooded on the Eastern Front, were also in motion. Even the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, still raw, still young, many of its members barely 20 years old, was being assembled in France, its tanks and vehicles gathering in training areas east of the Seine. These men had lived in Russia. They had known winters that froze the oil in their engines and summers of dust and blood across a continent. Now they were being withdrawn from that grinding meat grinder, told they would have rest, refitting, reorganization. But the soldiers themselves, the company commanders and sergeants and tank crews who understood the war in a way the High Command sometimes did not, they sensed something different about this posting. France was not Russia. France was the gateway to Germany. If the Allies broke through here, there was nothing but home behind the line. The build-up was methodical, but also, in its way, anxious. SS officers moved through the training camps with an intensity that the men noticed. Tank exercises became more frequent. Gunnery practice was rehearsed with particular attention to new American armor. Intelligence briefings spoke of tremendous Allied strength gathering across the Channel. The numbers of planes, ships, divisions, waiting for the right weather, the right moment. One did not need to be a general to understand that such an assembly meant only one thing. And Hitler, far away in his East Prussian headquarters, had made it clear that this invasion, whenever it came, must be thrown back into the sea within the first 48 hours. There would be no gradual retreat, no trading space for time, as there had been in Russia. Here, on French soil, the line had to hold. The Norman landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. In the villages around Saint-Lô and Caen, around Vire and Falaise, the local population felt the weight of waiting armies. German soldiers occupied the towns and the countryside, but not with the ease of occupation anymore. There was vigilance. Checkpoints became more frequent. Tank parks were hidden in woods. Divisional headquarters moved constantly, never staying in the same chateau or commandeered mansion for more than a few days. The roads became observation posts. Every crossroad mattered. Every ridge and ravine was studied on maps, marked, memorized, prepared. If the enemy came, and they would come, everyone knew this. The terrain itself would be the first defense. The SS divisions settling into these areas in spring 1944 were not the same units that had conquered France in 1940. That had been blitzkrieg, armor and motorcycles sweeping through flat country, moving faster than resistance could form. This time, they would be fighting in bocage, in the dense, ancient hedgerow country that the Normans had cultivated for centuries. Small fields bounded by earth banks and overgrown vegetation, stone walls, sunken roads where centuries of wagon traffic had worn the earth down below the level of the surrounding fields. It was terrain that favored the defender, but also, paradoxically, favored the defender who understood it. The SS divisions did not. Their experience was with open steppes, with villages burning on the horizon, with depth and maneuver. The Norman bocage was claustrophobic, intimate, nothing at all like the vast spaces where they had learned their trade. And there was another thing happening too, something perhaps more subtle than the mere logistics of moving divisions across occupied territory. The SS Panzer Arm, despite its legendary reputation, was changing. New tanks were arriving, the Panther and the Tiger, machines of considerable power and sophistication. But the crews who would crew them were not always the hard-bitten veterans of the Russian campaigns. Some were, but others were young men, replacements, conscripts into the SS, now that the war was consuming men faster than the original ideological membership could provide. The old corps remained, and it remained formidable, but the percentages were shifting. The iron was becoming diluted with steel of a different temper. As spring turned toward early summer, the training intensified. Defensive positions were plotted. Mobile reserves were rehearsed. The 1st SS Panzer Corps commander, General Sepp Dietrich, a character of great confidence and considerable battlefield cunning, moved between his divisions with quiet authority. He was Hitler's man, personally chosen to command the reserve, and he bore the weight of that responsibility. Intelligence estimates of Allied strength grew more alarming week by week. The number of aircraft the Allies could bring to bear, the quantity of artillery they possessed, the size of the naval bombardment they could deliver, these things seemed almost abstract in their scale, too large to conceive as reality. But the officers and NCOs who had fought in Russia knew that the Allies now wielded such strength. They had seen what air power could do. They had learned that the old ways of massed armor and concentrated punch could be shattered from the sky. The weeks of May moved into June with an odd, aching quietness. The weather was unsettled, which was actually a comfort to the German commanders. The invasion could not come in bad conditions, they reasoned. And yet, there was also the beginning of restlessness in the units. The men were trained and retrained. The tanks were positioned and repositioned. Intelligence reports came in fragments, rumors, disconnected pieces of information. Allied deception was skillful. The Germans were convinced the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And so, positioned as they were, the SS Panzer Divisions waited. They waited in the quiet Norman spring, in farmyards and woodlots and the courtyards of requisitioned estates, their engines maintained, their ammunition sorted and stacked, their crews resting and preparing and wondering what the next few weeks would bring. The night of June 5th into the morning of the 6th arrived with a strange electricity that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Across the Norman countryside, in barracks and encampments hidden beneath trees, and in villages far from the coast, the men of the SS Panzer Divisions began to move. Not in panic, not yet, but with the careful, measured efficiency of machinery winding toward its purpose. The orders had come down through channels that morning. Whispered first, then confirmed, then suddenly undeniable. The Allies were coming. Not a raid, not a feint. The invasion had begun somewhere out across the channel, and every minute that passed was a minute the Wehrmacht was losing ground they might never recover. For the commanders of these divisions, men who had grown accustomed to their own invincibility on the vast steppes of Russia, the realization must have felt like stepping into a nightmare where the rules no longer applied. They had come to France with a particular kind of confidence, the confidence of soldiers who had seen entire Soviet armies shattered before them, who had watched Tiger tanks roll through enemy positions almost unmolested, who carried with them the weight of victories that had seemed to prove their doctrine, their training, their faith in German armor was without equal. But France was not Russia. The skies above Normandy did not belong to the Luftwaffe anymore, and the moment the order came to move toward the coast, every man in those divisions, from the highest officer down to the youngest loader in a Panther tank, was about to discover just how different this war would be. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the oldest and most storied of the SS Panzer formations, was stationed around the town of Wehr, roughly 60 kilometers inland from the beaches where the Americans were already wading ashore. Their commander, Colonel Kurt Meyer, Panzermeyer, as he was known, a slight, intense officer with the nervous energy of a man who had always advanced first and asked permission later, had been watching the sky since dawn. The RAF and the American Air Forces had been operating with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Wave after wave of fighter bombers swept across the Norman landscape, and the sound of their engines had become the soundtrack to the morning itself. This was something the SS Panzer Divisions had not faced in the East, at least not with such overwhelming consistency. The Russians had air power, yes, but nothing like this. Nothing like the seemingly endless stream of Mustangs and Spitfires that could appear above your column at any moment and turn a perfectly ordered formation into a nightmare of burning metal and smoke. The Das Reich Division, perhaps the most infamous of the Waffen-SS armored units, was located even farther south, near Toulouse, more than 500 kilometers from the invasion beaches. Their orders, when they finally came, were brutally simple: move north to Normandy as quickly as possible and attack the beachhead. Drive through the night if you must. Ignore the roads if they are blocked. The division had perhaps 600 kilometers to cover, and they would have to cross a France that was becoming increasingly hostile. Word was spreading among the civilian population that the invasion had begun, and in those early hours of June 6th, the roads that the SS Panzer Divisions would need to travel were beginning to fill with Allied air power, with resistance fighters preparing ambushes, with a country that had been under occupation for 4 years suddenly awakening to the possibility that liberation might be within reach. consider the strange position these men found themselves in. They were soldiers of one of the most feared and capable military organizations in Europe, commanders of tanks that could outgun nearly anything the Allies possessed, trained to believe absolutely in their own superiority. And yet they were being asked to move in daylight across open roads toward an enemy that held unchallenged dominion over the air. The Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg divisions, both relatively new but already blooded in combat, were also receiving their movement orders that morning. Every division, every regiment, every company of the SS Panzer Arm in the west was being directed toward the beaches. The hope, presumably, was that they could arrive before the beachhead became too firmly established, that they could drive the invaders back into the sea before they could consolidate their positions and pour more men and material ashore. The mechanics of moving a panzer division in June 1944 were vastly more complicated than they had been 2 years earlier in Russia. A single SS Panzer Division consisted of perhaps 20,000 men, distributed across multiple regiments, with tanks, self-propelled guns, half-tracks, trucks, reconnaissance vehicles, engineering companies, medical units, supply trains. All of this had to move together, coordinate through a chain of command, refuel, maintain contact with headquarters, avoid massive Allied bombing campaigns that were ongoing even as the ground forces were still establishing themselves on the beaches. The vulnerability of these slow-moving columns was almost painful to contemplate. A tank could move at perhaps 40 kilometers per hour on a good road. The supply trucks behind them moved slower, and all the while, the sky above was filled with enemy aircraft. Some accounts suggest that the earliest reaction from the SS Panzer divisions was almost comically slow. Hitler himself had placed strict restrictions on the movement of the panzer reserves in occupied France, fearful that they might be used to launch unauthorized counterattacks, or that they might be drawn away from some mythical secondary invasion that was sure to come at Pas de Calais. By the time the orders finally came through to release them toward Normandy, hours had already passed. Hours in which the Allies had consolidated their beachheads, hours in which more men and equipment were pouring ashore, hours in which the window for a quick counterattack was silently closing. And even when the divisions did receive their movement orders, they had to contend with the French landscape itself. The roads of Normandy and beyond were not the broad, well-maintained highways of northern France. They were smaller, often narrower, wound through villages and past farmland, and every one of them was now becoming a gauntlet. The question that haunted commanders as they made their decisions that morning was not whether they could reach the coast, but whether they could reach the coast in time, and in what condition. The Luftwaffe was almost entirely absent. German fighters did appear occasionally, but they were so vastly outnumbered by the Allied air forces that their appearance was almost more psychologically damaging than helpful. A single Messerschmitt Bf 109 might appear over a column and be overwhelmed by a dozen Mustangs before it could accomplish anything. The SS Panzer Divisions, which had been taught to believe that superior German tactics and superior German training could overcome numerical disadvantages, were now confronted with a form of disadvantage they had never faced. It was not that the Allies were marginally better at air combat. It was that the Allies possessed such overwhelming air superiority that the question of who had better pilots or better aircraft became almost irrelevant. The sheer weight of numbers would eventually grind down any opposition, and the SS Panzer Divisions were about to drive directly into that grinding weight. The roads leading north from the bases of the SS Panzer Divisions that morning began to fill with vehicles, and the mechanical ballet of moving such a large military force began to unfold. Tank commanders reviewed their maps. Supply officers calculated fuel consumption and ammunition needs. Drivers gripped their steering wheels. Crews checked their weapons. And above it all, the sound of Allied aircraft engines growing gradually louder as the day progressed. The invasion had begun in the darkness before dawn. By the time most of the SS Panzer divisions were receiving their movement orders and beginning their northward push, it was already mid-morning, and the sun, when it could be seen through the haze and smoke of battle, was climbing higher in the sky. Every hour that passed was an hour the beachhead was becoming stronger, an hour more supplies were reaching the Allies, an hour less for the SS Panzer divisions to make their counterattack before the opportunity passed forever. The landscape itself became the enemy. As the German columns pushed toward the coast in those first days after D-Day, they encountered terrain unlike anything the tank crews had trained for, terrain that would strip away their greatest advantage, the open ground where armor could maneuver. The bocage, that peculiar Norman world of dense hedgerows, sunken lanes and small fields divided by walls of earth and thorns so thick that a man could barely push through them, closed around the divisions like the walls of a maze designed by nature specifically to neutralize their strength. Picture, if you will, a landscape that had been shaped by centuries of farming. Medieval landowners and their descendants built these hedgerows not for defense, but for marking boundaries and containing cattle. The banks beneath them rose sometimes 8, 10, even 12 feet high, reinforced by root systems so ancient and intertwined that a shell burst could rarely remove them entirely. Tanks and half-tracks, machines that had dominated in the vast steppes of Russia or the open plains of France just weeks before, now found themselves channeled into narrow corridors where they could be approached on foot, where a lone soldier with a Panzerfaust or a grenade could stop progress cold. The terrain reduced warfare to its most basic, most brutal form. The SS Panzer Divisions discovered this gradually, then catastrophically. Their reconnaissance screens, accustomed to ranging far ahead, suddenly found themselves blind. A Tiger tank, the most fearsome armored weapon in the world, became almost claustrophobic when hemmed in by 8-foot walls of earth. The crew inside could not see beyond the next hedgerow. The loader, the gunner, the driver all felt a kind of suffocation, a compression of their world from hundreds of meters to perhaps 30 yards of visibility. Imagine sitting inside a steel box, buttoned up against unseen enemies, unable to see more than a few dozen meters in any direction, knowing that at any moment an anti-tank gun or a bazooka team might be waiting just beyond that next wall of vegetation. The Americans and British learned quickly how to fight in this terrain. They broke their infantry into small groups, used the hedgerows themselves as cover, and moved through the bocage with a patience and deliberation that the SS division's commanders found infuriating. Rather than attempting grand maneuvers, the fighting became hand-to-hand, yard by yard, hedgerow by hedgerow. A German counterattack that might have routed infantry in open ground became bogged down immediately. A panzer advance that should have swept everything before it moved at walking pace, stopping frequently, taking casualties not from massed armor, but from hidden riflemen and carefully sighted anti-tank guns. The grinding attrition began almost at once. The 2nd SS Panzer das Reich, one of the most battle-hardened divisions in the Wehrmacht, arrived from the south to find itself in a nightmare landscape. For every mile they advanced toward the coast, they lost men and vehicles. The division's panzer strength, usually the measure of success or failure, meant far less here than sheer determination and willingness to absorb casualties. Tank columns that in open ground could expect to dominate any engagement found themselves advancing through bottlenecks where a single anti-tank gun could hold them for hours. Did you know that the bocage fighting, though rarely as famous as the great armored clashes of history, produced casualty rates per unit that often exceeded even the most intense tank battles? Men were being lost to individual riflemen, to mines, to grenades thrown from hedgerows above. The Leibstandarte, Hitler's personal bodyguard division, found itself similarly constrained. These men, selected for ideological purity and physical prowess, discovered that neither counted for much when they were fighting through a maze of hedgerows against opponents who understood the terrain and knew how to use it. The loss of momentum was devastating to morale. The SS divisions had built their reputation on rapid, violent breakthroughs. The bocage offered none of that. Every advance was measured in minutes of ground gained and hours of casualties absorbed. There was a kind of claustrophobia to it all. The sky, which in the open steppes had offered freedom and threat in equal measure, was now cut off by walls of vegetation. The Luftwaffe, which had once controlled the skies during German offensives, was now barely present. German formations moved through a kind of twilight world, their vision compressed, their firepower paradoxically reduced by the very terrain that should have made them stronger. The open landscape that had once favoured the panzers became a distant memory. Men spoke of feeling caged. As days turned into weeks, the reality of bocage fighting set in. The Hohenstaufen division, committed to the line in early July, found itself ground down by what seemed like an endless succession of small-scale engagements. Each hedgerow crossed was a minor victory and a minor defeat. The cumulative effect was devastating. Tanks that had survived multiple Russian offensives were lost to anti-tank guns sighted by men who had barely been in combat before. Vehicles broke down or became bogged in muddy lanes. Morale, which had been sustained by rapid victories and territorial gains, began to fray as men realized they were losing ground inch by inch, despite their supposed superiority. The bocage also meant that casualties were often unrecoverable. In open ground, a damaged tank might be towed away for repair. In the hedgerow maze, it might become a tomb or a trophy lost to the enemy. Recovery crews, operating in such tight terrain, faced constant danger. A single anti-tank gun positioned with care could command an entire lane and prevent evacuation of casualties. The German doctrine of aggressive counterattack, which had worked so well in earlier campaigns, now meant throwing men and armor into situations where the terrain itself had already defeated them before the shooting started. Think of it this way. The bocage transformed every engagement from a question of tactics and firepower into a question of will. Could you keep pushing through terrain that seemed designed to stop you? Could your men maintain cohesion when they could barely see each other? Could your vehicles move through lanes so narrow they could barely fit? The SS divisions, for all their elite status and combat experience, found themselves asking these questions with increasing desperation as July wore on. The grinding attrition was not dramatic. There were no great battles, no sweeping encirclements to report to Berlin. Instead, there was a steady erosion of strength. A patrol moving down a sunken lane loses half its men to machine gun fire from above. A tank column advances 2 kilometers in a day at a cost of 3 vehicles. A counterattack fails not because of enemy numbers, but because men become exhausted fighting through terrain that resists every step. By the end of July, the SS Panzer Divisions that had arrived in Normandy, confident in their superiority, were far smaller, far more tired, and far less sure of their purpose than they had been just weeks before. The bocage had not defeated them with a dramatic blow, but rather worn them down with the patience of a landscape that had resisted all violence for centuries and would continue to do so. To understand what was truly happening across those Norman fields in the summer of 1944, we might pause and slip into something far more intimate than strategy maps and casualty counts. We might imagine ourselves inside the metal body of a Panther tank on an ordinary morning in late July, when the sun rises early over the bocage and the day's orders have just come through. What was it like to live in that world of 5 men, pressed so close that you could hear your gunners breathing and smell the sweat and diesel that never quite washed from your skin? The tank commander, usually an Obersturmführer or experienced Unterscharführer, would have been awake before dawn, his head stuck up through the turret hatch, eyes scanning the Norman landscape for movement, for the telltale silhouettes of American Thunderbolts or Mustangs. The war in the Bocage had taught him never to assume daylight meant safety. Quite the opposite. Daylight meant the sky belonged to the Allies, and every hour of brightness was borrowed time that could vanish in the space of a heartbeat. Below him, in the driver's compartment at the front left of the hull, the driver was already performing his ritual checks. His name might have been Klaus, or Hans, or any of 10,000 others, a boy who had joined the Waffen-SS at 17, believing in something then that the endless churning of the war had slowly worn away. His job was the simplest in conception and the most exhausting in practice. He had to know every response of his machine, the weight of the Panther at 45 tons, the power of the Maybach engine, the precise moment when the transmission would respond to his input. In the cramped space, with armor all around him and only a small periscope slot to see through, he sat with his head bent slightly forward, waiting for the commander's orders that would come through the intercom. The headsets were essential now, voices crackling through the electrical line, urgent or calm depending on what was happening outside. He could hear the engine ticking, the slight hiss of hydraulics, the rattle of ammunition in the storage racks behind the turret. These sounds became a comfort of sorts, because as long as the machine was speaking in its familiar language, nothing terrible was happening yet. The gunner occupied the right side of the turret, and his world was the optical sight mounted in the gun mantlet. He had perhaps the clearest view of what was occurring outside, but also the most limited field of perception. Through his scope, he could see only what the gun was pointed at, a narrow rectangle of magnified landscape. Everything else was darkness. He was waiting. That was the true job of a tank gunner in 1944, particularly for the SS crews who had learned harshly that they could no longer fight the Allies in open tank versus tank engagements. The Allies outnumbered them so completely now, and their air power was like a god looking down from above. So the Panther crews hid in villages, in copses of trees, in reverse slopes where they could see the Germans' ancestral plains of France, and wait for American armor to emerge from the rolling terrain. The gunner might wait 8 hours without firing. He might wait 20 hours. And then, if he was lucky, a Sherman would appear 300 meters away, and he would have perhaps 3 seconds to acquire it in his scope, calculate the range by the mil dots, adjust for range and deflection, and fire. If he was good, and his nerve held, and the gun responded as it should, the Sherman would burn. If he was even a moment late or half a meter off, his tank would be the one that burned, and the Panther crew would have 5 seconds at most to bail out. The loader, squeezed into the left side of the turret, occupied a place of controlled chaos. He was a boy, often younger than the driver, his job to take the 75mm shells from the ammunition racks, feed them into the breech after the spent casing had been ejected, and do this while moving, while the tank was being fired upon, while shells were impacting the armor and the whole machine was vibrating like a struck bell. The physical demand was enormous. Each round weighed about 30 kilograms. A good loader could cycle a new round into the breech in under 10 seconds. The best crews, the ones that had survived the Eastern Front and understood that speed meant survival, could do it in 6 or 7. But the loading hatch was small, the space was suffocating, and there was always the dread that this time, the next round would be the one that punched through the armor, that the loader would feel the sudden howling pressure and heat of a penetrating hit, and the last thing he would experience would be chaos that no mind could fully comprehend. And the radio operator, wedged into the smallest space of all, beneath the commander's seat, maintained the voice connection to the other tanks in the platoon and company. He was the ears and throat of the formation, reporting positions, relaying orders, sometimes receiving the message that another tank in the unit had been hit. When that happened, there was a pause in the static, a break in the mechanical rhythm, and the radio operator knew what had occurred. His friend, his comrade who had slept near him in the barn the night before, was suddenly gone. The sounds inside a Panther tank were a constant sensory presence that never allowed the crew to forget they were trapped in a machine. The engine roared at operational throttle, a deep diesel rumble that you felt in your sternum, that vibrated through the armor plating and into your bones. The transmission whined and clattered as gears engaged and disengaged. The gun turret traversed with a thin, mechanical shriek when the hydraulics drove it. Radio chatter came through the headsets as distorted voices, almost mechanical themselves, speaking in the abbreviated codes and call signs that military crews everywhere had developed. The shell casings fell to the floor with a metallic clang that rang like a bell in the confined space. When the gun fired, the percussion was not loud inside the turret, but rather seemed to compress the entire interior space, a sudden pressure that left your ears ringing and your vision momentarily displaced. The smell was perhaps even more overwhelming than the sound. Diesel exhaust that had nowhere to go, the sharp metallic odor of cordite from the gun, sweat, unwashed human bodies crammed into a space no larger than a telephone booth, in heat that could reach 40 degrees Celsius in midsummer with the hatch closed. Hydraulic fluid, gun oil, the rubber of the gun mantlet seals. Spent ammunition casings grew hot and added their own metallic warmth to the enclosed air. After hours in that space, a man could never quite wash the smell from his uniform or his skin. It became part of him, the odor of the SS Panzer crewman. And then there was the fear. Not the sharp, acute fear of a man running across an open field under fire, but rather a deeper, more pervasive dread that came from the understanding that you were sitting inside 5 tons of metal that could be penetrated by an anti-tank gun from 2 kilometers away, that could be struck from above by a bomb dropped from an aircraft you would never see, that could catch fire and burn so completely that there would be nothing left to identify. The fear was sharpened by the knowledge that you could do almost nothing about it. You could not run. You could not hide. You could only sit and wait, and trust that the machine would protect you, and that your commander's judgment about where to position the tank was correct, and that your luck would hold. And above all of this, there was the sound the crews feared most of all, not the shriek of approaching shells or the grinding collapse of the transmission, but rather the distant drone of aircraft engines. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a distinctive sound, a deep, rolling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Allied pilots had learned that tank crews became motionless when they heard it, that the tankers would suppress their impulse to move and hope instead that the metal around them would protect them. The pilots exploited this. They would come in low, at rooftop height, and rake the countryside with machine gun fire and anti-tank rockets. A Panther's top armor was weak, designed as it had been to defeat anti-tank rounds fired horizontally, not rockets dropped from above at a steep angle. Men who survived these attacks described a moment of utter helplessness, the whole tank shaking from the impacts, the screaming of metal, the howl of hydraulic lines rupturing, and then, if you were very unlucky, the sudden blooming of fire inside the fighting compartment, and the terrible knowledge, in the last seconds of consciousness, that you had run out of luck. The crews of the SS Panzer Divisions were aware of their reputation. They knew that they were considered the elite of the German armoured forces, that their divisions had done things on the Eastern Front that had become legend. The first SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte had been Hitler's Praetorian Guard. The second SS Das Reich had carved a reputation through Russia and Ukraine that preceded them into France. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, were younger but equally trained, equally committed. And yet, by the summer of 1944, sitting inside a Panther tank in the bocage, waiting for the sound of aircraft engines, knowing that the Americans had air superiority so complete that every daylight hour was borrowed time, many of these crews understood something that the propaganda had never conveyed to them. The reputation, the elite status, the terrible efficiency they had demonstrated for 5 years, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was how much luck you had left. What mattered was whether the penetrating round would find you or miss you by a few centimeters. What mattered was whether the aircraft came from the left or right, whether the commander's positioning of the tank would protect or expose the crew. In those silent moments before contact, in those hours of waiting in the Norman summer, the SS Panzer crews were learning a lesson that every army eventually learns, that no amount of training or toughness or ideological commitment can overcome the reality of being outmatched. And by August 1944, they were beginning to understand that the war was not moving toward German victory, but rather toward an ending they could not control. The summer rain had begun to fall more frequently across Normandy by late July, cooling the hedgerows that had been scorched by weeks of grinding combat. For the German defenders, these July days held a peculiar tension. The American forces pressing against their lines seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, while German reserves either lay scattered and exhausted or remained pinned down by forces they dared not abandon. It was in this atmosphere of mounting pressure that the Allies prepared to execute what they had long been planning, a wholesale breakout from the bocage, a widening of their foothold that would finally leverage the overwhelming advantage in men and material they possessed. The operation had a name, Cobra, and it represented a fundamental shift in the strategy of the Western Allies. Where before they had been feeling their way through the Norman hedgerows, probing and testing German defences, now they would attempt something bolder. The plan called for a massive bombardment to shatter the German line around Saint-Lô, a town that had become synonymous with the grinding stalemate of the American advance. On July 25th, under grey skies and the rolling sound of approaching aircraft, thousands of tons of bombs fell on a narrow corridor ahead of the American 7th Corps. The earth trembled. Defenders huddled in their foxholes and reinforced positions, many of them infantry divisions that had been worn down by weeks of hedgerow fighting. When the bombing lifted and the dust settled, the German line had been catastrophically damaged. What followed was a flood. American armor and mechanized infantry poured through the breached section of the German front. The bocage, which had seemed so impenetrable just weeks earlier, suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a maze that the Americans were learning to navigate with increasing speed. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, had been waiting for this moment. His forces, which had been hemmed in and frustrated by the close terrain, now had room to maneuver. Divisions wheeled south and west, pressing toward the town of Avranches, the gateway to Brittany and the broader Atlantic coast. The momentum was palpable, though it may seem strange to think of momentum in war as anything but terrible. Yet from a purely strategic perspective, the Americans had broken through what had been the most critical German defensive line in Normandy. And here was where the weakness of the German position became glaringly apparent. The SS Panzer Divisions, which had been committed piecemeal to the defense of Normandy since the very morning of the landings, had suffered mounting losses. Some, like the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, had been fighting continuously for nearly 2 months with minimal replacements. Their tank strength had dwindled, their crews were exhausted. The divisions that had dominated the Eastern Front with their superior tactics and aggression were being worn away by a war of attrition they could not win. The Allies, for all the stubbornness of the bocage fighting, had something the Germans did not: an apparently endless flow of new tanks, new men, new ammunition arriving from across the English Channel and from American factories thousands of miles away. General Günther Blaskowitz, the commander of Army Group G to the south, watched this development with growing alarm. The collapse of the German line around Saint-Lô meant that the American forces could now wheel around and threaten to encircle the entire German position in Normandy. If the Americans reached Avranches, if they broke into open country beyond the Bocage, then what? The German front, which was already precarious, might shatter entirely. Reports of American mechanized columns pushing rapidly southward began to accumulate. The German command structure, which had been fractured by the loss of Field Marshal Rommel in the bombing on July 17th and the bomb plot against Hitler only days later, struggled to formulate a coherent response. What was happening in late July was a subtle but unmistakable shift in the balance of power in Normandy. The Germans had not been decisively defeated in any single engagement. No grand canaille, no Sedan, no sudden encirclement had yet occurred. But the steady pressure of the American advance, the constant attrition of German forces, and the successful rupture of the German line had created a strategic crisis. The very thing the German High Command had feared most was beginning to unfold, a situation in which the Allies could leverage their numerical superiority and industrial might to dictate the pace and direction of the campaign. The SS Panzer Divisions found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. They had been moved repeatedly from one crisis point to another, committed to counterattacks that gained little ground at great cost, and held in reserve waiting for opportunities that never materialized in the way commanders had hoped. The Hohenstaufen Division, which had arrived in Normandy with around 150 tanks, had been reduced to perhaps 40 serviceable armoured vehicles. The Frundsberg Division faced similar erosion. These were still formidable units, still capable of inflicting casualties on their opponents, but they were no longer the overwhelming force they had been on the Eastern Front, or even at the beginning of the Normandy campaign. By the last week of July, as the American breakout accelerated and the German left flank, the southern boundary of the German position in Normandy, began to collapse, a subtle but unmistakable realization began to dawn on senior German commanders. The question that had begun as a whisper now grew louder. Could they still hold Normandy at all? The Atlantic Wall, that great fortification that had been promised as the guarantor of German security, had been breached and was now being left behind. The interior lines had been punctured, the reserves had been committed and exhausted. And still the Americans came on, methodical and relentless, caring little for the tactical elegance of maneuver, but simply driving forward with the crushing weight of superior numbers and resources. The collapse of the German left flank was not a single dramatic moment. It was instead a succession of smaller breakdowns in the coherence of the German defensive position. Infantry divisions, their ranks depleted, began to fold under pressure rather than hold their ground in counterattack. Gaps opened between unit boundaries. Communication with higher headquarters became difficult and then impossible. And into these gaps poured American armor and motorized infantry, widening the breach, ensuring that what had begun as a local rupture would become a strategic catastrophe. The SS Panzer Divisions, so long the crisis firefighters of the German army, found themselves increasingly unable to respond effectively. They were needed everywhere and could be nowhere in sufficient strength. It was in the chaos of late July, as American forces began their vast, grinding wheel eastward toward Paris and beyond, that Hitler made a decision that would echo through the narrow valleys around Falaise like the final note of a doomed symphony. In his underground command bunker, far from the Norman mud, isolated from the reality of what was unfolding in the hedgerows, the Führer had become convinced of something that seemed, to his generals in the field, almost dreamlike in its disconnection from what their eyes and ears were telling them. He believed that the American advance could be cut in half, not merely slowed, not contained, severed, bisected. The grand offensive that General Omar Bradley had carefully orchestrated could, if struck at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right force, be broken into two separate armies, unable to support one another, vulnerable and isolated. This was the dream that took shape in those sweltering late July days, and it was a dream that had enough surface logic, enough mathematical appeal, that it drew the desperate agreement of commanders who should, perhaps, have resisted more forcefully. The American spearhead, driving south from the Cotentin Peninsula, was relatively narrow. General Courtney Hodges' First Army, anchored around Saint-Lô and pressing toward Brittany and the Loire Valley, seemed to present a kind of gap, a seam that might be split open. What if the German forces still intact in Normandy and the SS Panzer Divisions remained, despite their losses, the most formidable striking force available, could wheel westward in a coordinated blow aimed at the town of Mortain, strike the American columns as they marched, and drive through to the coast at Avranches? The two-pronged thrust of the American assault would be separated. The southern prong, racing toward the ports and the open country beyond, would be isolated from the north. Resupply would become impossible. The pocket would reverse. The Germans would regain initiative. It was a beautiful theory. And like so many theories born from desperation rather than from careful calculation, it did not account for the full reality of the situation on the ground. The American forces, though advancing, were not the scattered, exhausted remnants that Hitler seemed to believe them to be. They were growing stronger by the day, better supplied, their lines increasingly robust, and the Germans, even their elite formations, were being worn down in 1,000 small ways that headquarters intelligence reports could never quite capture. But the order was given. The counterattack would be launched toward Mortain. It would begin on August 7th. And it would involve some of the finest armored formations in the Third Reich, including elements of Panzer Corps II, SS divisions that had survived Africa, Russia, and now Normandy. The commanders receiving these orders faced a peculiar kind of torment. General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, who led the SS Panzer Corps, knew the tactical situation. He could read a map as well as anyone. The idea of launching an offensive when you were already struggling to hold your defensive positions, when your lines were already crumbling, when you were already short of fuel and ammunition and air cover, it seemed almost like a command to waltz into the jaws of a trap. Yet there was, in the German military structure of 1944, a particular difficulty in saying no to Adolf Hitler. The old Prussian traditions of command had eroded. Initiative from below was increasingly frowned upon. Loyalty had become more important than military judgment, and so, despite grave doubts, the order was prepared to be executed. What makes Mortain so crucial to understanding what became the Falaise Pocket is that it was a moment when German strategy finally, completely, became untethered from German capability. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS had been steadily losing the initiative since the first dawn on the Normandy beaches. The hedgerows and the reinforced strength of the beachhead had prevented them from throwing the Allies back into the sea, despite everything they had tried in June and July. Now, in early August, as the American forces began to break out and wheel south and east, the German High Command made a choice that was perhaps the opposite of what prudence would have suggested. Instead of consolidating, instead of carefully trading space for time and attempting to establish new defensive lines as they withdrew, they decided to attack. The strategic gamble was, in essence, this. The Germans would trade what little operational flexibility they possessed, the concentrated panzer reserves that they might have used to establish a fighting withdrawal, in exchange for a desperate bid to change the momentum of the entire campaign. If Mortain could be seized, if the Americans could be struck while still somewhat disorganized, perhaps the entire American southwestern drive could be halted. Perhaps, and this is where the dream took on its most fragile quality, perhaps the Allies would lose faith in their offensive power. Perhaps they would hesitate. Perhaps they would regroup far enough back that a new German defensive line could be established, perhaps along the Loire River, perhaps even farther east. The arithmetic of such hopes was not encouraging, but they were hopes nonetheless, and in the penumbra of the Third Reich in the summer of 1944, hopes were becoming increasingly precious. The divisions that would form the spearhead of this counterattack were SS units that had earned their fearsome reputation through years of unrelenting combat. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, with its Mephistophelian insignia and its long history of violence across Eastern Europe, would be at the center of the blow. So too would elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, that original elite guard unit that had evolved into something far more terrible than ceremonial protectors. The 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, relatively fresh from campaigns in the East, would add its weight. These were, as terrible as they were, precisely the kinds of formations that might, under ideal circumstances, achieve something remarkable. And yet, as the orders filtered down through the command structure in the pre-dawn darkness of August 6th, as tank crews began to roll out of their hedgerow lagers and motor pools toward their assembly areas near the town of Mortain, there was a quality to the enterprise that felt, to many who participated in it, like a last roll of dice by a desperate gambler. The Americans, for their part, had begun to sense that something was coming. The intelligence networks, the aerial reconnaissance, the steady drone of Allied air superiority overhead, all of these were feeding back reports of German movement, of concentration, of something being prepared in the grey dawns and misty mornings around the Norman bocage. General Bradley received warnings. The frontline commanders began to shift their dispositions, and in the early morning hours of August 7th, as the German attack went in, the American forces, though surprised, were not entirely unprepared. They would hold at Mortain. They would hold at the crucial crossroads. And in holding, they would begin to set the conditions for something that would unfold over the next 2 weeks with an almost inexorable logic: the encirclement, the pocket, the grinding destruction of the very formations that Hitler had sent forward in his final bid to reverse the course of the Normandy campaign. The choice had been made, the die had been cast, and like so much else in the Third Reich's twilight, the consequences would be paid not by those who made the decision, but by those who had to execute it on the ground, in the noise and the dust and the smoke of battle. The counterattack at Mortain, ordered by Hitler on August 6, 1944, was meant to be a surgical thrust that would split the advancing American forces and stabilize the entire German position in Normandy. But from the very first hours, the operation crumbled against realities that the High Command, far from the bocage, had simply not grasped. The SS Panzer Divisions, still formidable on paper, were about to discover that reputation alone could no longer stop what was bearing down upon them from above. The initial assault went forward in darkness and fog, which might have offered some shelter from the Allied air force that had become the true master of the Norman sky. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, along with elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, drove westward toward the small town of Mortain with what force they could muster. They achieved tactical surprise in those first hours, and briefly it seemed as though German will and steel might yet carve out a corridor of victory. But as dawn broke on August 7th, the fog lifted, and the sky above the advancing columns filled with the sound that every German soldier had come to dread. The typhoons and thunderbolts arrived in waves, their rockets and machine gun fire turning the narrow roads into killing grounds. Imagine the helplessness of a tank commander, peering out from his hatch, watching the sky darken with incoming aircraft, knowing that his armor, however thick, was nearly useless against attacks from directly overhead. The panzer crews could fight other tanks, they could manage infantry, but they could not fight the air itself. By August 8th, it had become clear that the Mortain offensive would not break through. The Americans, far from being severed or routed, had already anticipated the counterattack and had shifted their reserves to contain it. The SS divisions had committed their precious remaining reserves of fuel, ammunition, and mobile troops to an offensive that gained only a few kilometers of ground before stalling against a defense that grew stronger by the hour. General Paul Hauser, commanding the 7th Army, could see the mathematics of the situation shifting before his eyes. The Americans, instead of being cut off, were consolidating their breakout. They were beginning to wheel eastward and northward, as if to encircle the entire German force in Normandy. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had only recently arrived in France and was already struggling with the impossible situation he had inherited, sent urgent messages up the chain of command. The offensive must stop. The formations must consolidate. A retreat toward more defensible positions must begin. But the orders that came back from Hitler's headquarters were categorical. Hold, attack, do not yield ground, do not retreat. It is a strange and melancholy fact of warfare that when a commander has lost the ability to perceive reality, the soldiers beneath him begin to lose the ability to survive. The Falaise Pocket did not spring into existence in a single moment. It formed gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, as German forces that should have been withdrawing deeper into France found themselves hemmed in by movements they could no longer effectively counter. The Americans, under General Omar Bradley, were driving hard to the east and then northward toward Alençon, cutting off the southern and eastern avenues of retreat. The Canadians and British, despite the grueling nature of their own fighting in the Bocage, were pressing down from the north and west. And the German leadership, bound by Hitler's refusal to authorize a general withdrawal, found themselves unable to order the pullback that might have saved significant forces from encirclement. What had been a fluid, if dangerous, situation in late July was rapidly hardening into something far more catastrophic. Pockets of armor and infantry that might have slipped away eastward in the first days of August now found their withdrawal routes closing behind them, road by road, town by town. The SS divisions, in particular, began to experience the psychological shock of this reversal. These were units that had spent years on the offensive, that had become accustomed to seizing ground, to attacking into weakness, to dispersing enemy forces through shock and concentrated firepower. The idea of being surrounded, of being pushed into a shrinking space where maneuver was no longer possible, seemed almost abstract to them initially. But the evidence began to accumulate with sickening speed. Supply columns that were supposed to reach them did not arrive. Orders came through the wireless that contradicted themselves within hours. Reconnaissance patrols returned, with increasingly dire reports of Allied movement to the east and south. Officers who had grown used to operating with strategic confidence suddenly found themselves making tactical decisions in near total ignorance of the larger picture. The fog of war, in its most literal and most crushing sense, had descended upon them. By August 12th and 13th, the trap had tightened considerably. The Germans now controlled only a roughly rectangular piece of Norman terrain, perhaps 25 miles from north to south, and considerably narrower from east to west, with the town of Falaise roughly at its center. This was no longer a pocket in the sense of a temporary encirclement. This was the beginnings of what would become a grave. The roads leading eastward out of the pocket, toward Paris and the Seine, were increasingly interdicted by Allied artillery and airstrikes. The roads leading south, toward the Loire and open country, were no longer under German control. The roads to the west led only deeper into the Allied lines. The SS divisions, along with their regular German army counterparts, now faced a terrible choice: fight in place and be annihilated in a shrinking perimeter, attempt breakout operations against increasingly organized Allied positions, or surrender. For many of these men, surrender was not truly an option. The years of Nazi ideology, the specific indoctrination of the Waffen-SS, the fear of what Soviet captivity might mean if they were pushed eastward, the simple pride that men feel when facing annihilation together. All of these combined to make continued resistance the default assumption. The early losses at Mortain had been substantial. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had suffered casualties in armor and personnel that it could not replace. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, which had been brought into the fighting to support the Mortain offensive, had lost contact with supporting formations and found itself dangerously scattered across the Norman landscape. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend, which had been ground down in weeks of bitter fighting around Caen, was now committed to holding the northern edge of the pocket, where the Canadians and Poles were beginning their final push. Each of these divisions had begun the Normandy campaign with somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 combat troops. By mid-August, their strength had been halved. The tanks that had been promised as replacements had not arrived. The artillery ammunition that was supposed to sustain a sustained defense was being carefully rationed. The fuel reserves that would be needed for any organized withdrawal were dwindling day by day. And still, Hitler's orders continued to speak of counterattacks and holding every foot of ground. Wonder, if you will, at the strange collision between the will of a distant dictator and the physical reality facing men who could see, from hilltops and church steeples, the increasing numbers of Allied vehicles, artillery pieces, and soldiers converging toward them. The formation of the Falaise Pocket was thus not a sudden disaster that befell the SS Panzer Divisions, but rather the inevitable consequence of a series of decisions made at every level, from Hitler refusing to authorize retreat, to von Kluge unable to effectively challenge those orders, to divisional commanders trying to salvage something from an increasingly impossible situation. By August 13th, the true nature of their predicament had become clear. They were no longer fighting a war of maneuver, they were fighting a war of survival. And that survival would require either a miracle of German military ingenuity or a willingness to cut losses and withdraw while escape routes still existed. The days that followed would be among the most desperate in the entire history of the Waffen-SS. While the German commanders were wrestling with the collapsing situation west of Falaise, thousands of kilometers of coordinated movement were converging from every direction like the tightening grip of a hand around something fragile. The Allies, despite their own enormous logistical challenges and the friction of keeping multiple armies in motion, were beginning to sense something that had eluded them in the bocage for weeks: the possibility of encirclement. Not just a retreat, but a trap. The Canadians, who had been grinding northward through the Norman hedgerows with a particular grinding determination, understood perhaps better than anyone the cost of this war being waged in such intimate terrain. They had lost thousands in places with names that sounded almost quaint: Tilly-sur-Seulles, Caen, the orchard near Orthy, and each loss had taught them something about patience and the weight of holding ground in an enemy's homeland. By mid-August, as they pushed south from Caen along the spine of the hills toward the town of Falaise itself, they could feel the pressure mounting. Radio reports from their forward observers painted a picture of German columns moving erratically, some flowing eastward in an orderly retreat, others tangling up in chaotic knots where roads intersected and fuel ran dry. The Canadian intelligence officers, poring over maps in farmhouse headquarters, began to whisper a word that had seemed impossible weeks earlier: pocket. Polish forces, who carried their own deep historical memory of occupation and the bitterness of watching homeland suffer beneath a foreign boot, were pushing up from the southeast with a ferocity that sometimes caught their Allied commanders slightly off guard. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, under General Stanisław Maciek, had been held in reserve longer than most, waiting for the breakthrough that would allow armour to exploit an opening rather than get bogged down in hedgerow fighting. When that moment finally came in late July, they began racing northeastward with an intensity that spoke of something more than tactical doctrine. For many of these soldiers, The destruction of German armoured power was not merely a military objective, but something closer to a settling of accounts that their occupied nation deserved. They moved with purpose toward the coordinates that would eventually become Chambois and the eastern anchor of the closing trap. The Americans, meanwhile, were operating from a different axis entirely. Their breakout from the blockade under Operation Cobra had been designed to punch through rather than encircle, to create momentum and the possibility of rapid exploitation. As their columns swept eastward and then began to turn northward in a great wheeling motion, some of the divisional commanders began receiving orders that seemed to be shifting in real time. The strategy was evolving. What had started as a classical breakthrough was metamorphosing into something more ambitious. A double envelopment, a canny, though no one quite dared speak the name of the ancient Roman victory aloud. The Americans were accustomed to wars of attrition and material superiority. The idea of a grand encirclement, with all its German precedents on the Eastern Front, carried with it both promise and a certain anxiety about whether the trap could actually be sprung. The British, pressing from the west and north, added their own weight to the gathering pressure. They had been pushing against the Panzer Divisions since the landings, suffering the sharp edge of German armour whenever it concentrated. Their own armoured divisions, the Shermans and the Churchills, were not the equal of the Tigers or Panthers in one-on-one combat, and this fact had been etched into the consciousness of every British tank commander. But the Allies did not need to win tank-on-tank encounters. They could absorb losses in a way that the Germans simply could not. For every Sherman that burned, there were 3 more at the replacement depot. For every German Panther, there was increasingly nothing coming from the factories of Nuremberg and Dresden. What began to develop in the minds of the Allied commanders, particularly General Omar Bradley and the newly promoted General Louis B. Breton, was a picture of opportunity that required precision timing to exploit. The German divisions were not yet fully trapped. There were still open roads to the east, still corridors through which vehicles and men might escape if they moved quickly enough. But if the Allies could synchronize their movements properly, if the Canadians could advance from the north while the Americans turned northeast, and the Poles drove from the southeast, and the British maintained pressure from the west, then the circle would close. The German units already fought to exhaustion inside would have nowhere to go. The Canadian and Polish commanders understood their role in this unfolding drama with a clarity that perhaps differed from the American perspective. They were not simply pursuing a defeated enemy. They were racing to seal the eastern edge of a pocket that, if closed successfully, might destroy the armoured elite of Nazi Germany in one catastrophic encirclement. On August 14th, as the orders began to filter down through battalion and company commanders, men who had been fighting in a grinding, attritional campaign for weeks suddenly found themselves part of something that could be historically significant. The radio nets crackled with coordinates and timings. Supply columns pushed harder to keep pace. Everyone sensed that the next several days would determine not just the course of the campaign in Normandy, but possibly the shape of the entire war in Western Europe. There was, among the Allied soldiers as they moved into position, a curious mixture of emotions. There was exhaustion, certainly. There was the bone-deep weariness of men who had been living with danger as a constant companion. But there was also something else, a growing confidence that the long, grinding campaign through the hedgerows might actually be producing something decisive. The German defenders, who had seemed so formidable in early July, were beginning to show the signs of breaking. Their reserves were depleted, their reinforcements were not arriving, and now, instead of facing a linear front that stretched in all directions, they would soon face a closing circle with nowhere to retreat. For the men in the jeeps and half-tracks moving forward, for the tankers gunning their engines to push through the Norman roads, for the radio men calling in coordinates, and the officers studying maps by the light of flickering field lamps. The next few days represented the moment when all the accumulated sacrifice of the past 2 months might be converted into something approaching victory. It was a tension unlike the usual friction of combat. This was the tension of a trap being slowly and methodically set, of jaws beginning to close, and neither side, quite yet, knew exactly how brutal the closing would be. By the middle of August, the geography itself had become a trap. The Norman landscape, which had seemed so protective to the German defenders in those first weeks after D-Day, the dense bocage with its sunken lanes and Norman apple orchards, all those natural fortifications, now turned against them with a terrible logic. The roads narrowing toward the south and east had become the only way out, and those roads were closing. The Allies understood what was happening before many of the German commanders did. The Americans, driving hard from the west and southwest after the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, and the British and Canadians pressing from the north and northwest, had begun to sense the possibility of something far grander than a simple victory. They could see it in the maps and in the disposition of forces, a chance to encircle, to trap, perhaps even to destroy an entire German army group in a single catastrophic embrace. And so the pressure increased, but not frantically. It was methodical, patient in the way that a closing fist is patient. The landscape around Falaise became the stage for this narrowing. Picture the terrain as it existed in those days, rolling countryside dotted with small Norman towns, most of them medieval in origin, their stone buildings clustered around ancient churches. The roads connecting them, many dating back to Roman times, ran through valleys and across ridgelines that offered both concealment and vulnerability, depending on which side of the conflict you occupied. Chambois, a small town southeast of Falaise, became one of the critical choke points. So did Trun, a few kilometers to the north. These were not major cities, not strategic objectives in the way that Caen or Cherbourg had been. They were simply towns that happened to lie on the narrowing funnel through which the German forces would have to pass to escape. By August 12th, American forces under General Bradley had begun swinging eastward and northeastward, moving with the intention of cutting off the German retreat entirely. Canadian forces, having broken through south of Caen after weeks of grinding attritional warfare, pushed forward with a particular intensity. The Poles, having fought their way through the bocage at terrible cost, advanced with the grim determination of men who understood they were witnessing the unraveling of their enemy. British forces pressed along the flank. Day by day, the perimeter contracted. What had been a front 50 kilometers wide at the beginning of August was becoming an arc, then a tightening crescent, then something approaching a noose. The German High Command remained fragmented in its response. Some commanders understood the danger clearly. They could see it in the reports coming in from the front lines, in the increasingly frantic signals about American and British movements, in the realization that their escape routes were being cut one by one. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, the overall commander, grasped the gravity of the situation, yet he was also bound by Hitler's orders and his own uncertainty about whether a strategic withdrawal was truly possible. The SS commanders, for all their aggressive reputation, found themselves in a position where aggression could no longer save them. Their divisions had been hemorrhaging strength steadily since June. The Hitlerjugend, once so fearsome in its fanaticism, had been reduced through casualties and attrition to perhaps a quarter of its original strength. Das Reich, the most notorious of the SS Panzer Divisions, had similarly been worn down through the brutal weeks of bocage warfare. By mid-August, the roads leading south and east from Falaise were packed with retreating German forces, not in the organized manner of a controlled withdrawal, but increasingly in something closer to a flight. Supply columns mixed with infantry formations, Panzer and Panther tanks, some damaged, some still combat-capable, clogged the narrow roads. Artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, trucks carrying ammunition and fuel, all of it desperate to escape the narrowing corridor. The German units, still capable of coordinated movement, attempted to hold the towns that dominated the exits from the pocket. Chambord became crucial. It sat on the Paris road, one of the main routes southward. Trun, a few kilometers north, offered another escape route. The ridgelines around these towns provided positions from which even weakened German forces might mount a defense, at least temporarily. Consider the experience of being a German soldier in those days. You might have been a veteran of Russia, someone who had survived the incredible violence of the Eastern Front, or you might have been a replacement, a younger man hastily trained and sent to Normandy only weeks before. Either way, by August 12th, you would have sensed the change. The front that had been relatively static for weeks was suddenly fragmenting. Orders were becoming contradictory. Hold here, pull back there, establish a new line somewhere else. The SS divisions, for all their reputation, were no exception to this confusion. The structures of command that had held them together were beginning to dissolve under the pressure of military defeat. The British and Canadians, pushing from the north, moved toward Falaise itself. The town, which had given its name to the entire encirclement, was defended by elements of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and scattered Wehrmacht units. It was not an easy position to take. The defenders fought with the kind of desperation that characterized many SS units in their final moments of relative strength. But the Allies had the numbers, the artillery support, the air power. By August 17th, Falaise would fall to the Canadians. By then, however, the true crisis was not the town itself, but the vast number of German troops still trapped in the pocket to the south and east. What must it have felt like, in those days, to realize that your escape routes were closing? The roads that had seemed like paths to safety were becoming death traps. Allied planes, which had dominated the skies above Normandy since June, could now focus their attention almost exclusively on the retreat routes. The American and British armies, coordinating their movements with increasing precision, were slowly narrowing the gap. By August 15th, the pocket's perimeter was perhaps 40 kilometers across. By August 17th, it had contracted to perhaps 30 kilometers. By August 18th, the gap was becoming measurable in single-digit kilometers rather than tens of kilometers. The small towns took on an almost mythical significance in those final days. They were not merely places on a map, but desperate focal points where the fate of thousands might be decided in hours. The roads leading into and out of them became killing zones. One might imagine the sound of this retreat, not the organized movement of a well-supplied army on the march, but something far more chaotic. The roar of tank engines pushing at maximum throttle through narrow lanes. The crack of artillery fire, sometimes German, mostly Allied, falling on columns trying to move through open ground. The smell of diesel fuel and burned rubber. The calls and curses of officers trying to maintain some semblance of order among men who understood that they were being hunted. The geography of escape was impossibly constrained. The Norman countryside, for all its apparent openness, is actually quite restrictive. The network of small roads and farm lanes that soldiers and vehicles might use to bypass the main routes through places like Chambord and Trun was limited. The bocage still restricted visibility and movement for those trying to slip past the closing Allies. Tank crews, in particular, found that their vehicles were not suited to cross-country movement through terrain broken up by hedgerows and stone walls. They had to stick to the roads, and the roads were becoming death traps. The landscape had become unrecognizable in a matter of hours. What had once been ordered columns of armored vehicles, moving with the precision that SS training demanded, had dissolved into something far more primal, a river of metal and men flowing backward through the Norman countryside, searching desperately for any road still open, any path not yet sealed by the tightening Allied ring. By August 15th, perhaps the 16th, the exact dates began to blur in the chaos. The commanders of the Panzer Divisions found themselves presiding over something no longer resembling an army, but rather a massive, wounded creature thrashing in confusion. The retreat from Mortain, after the failed counterattack, had left the SS Division's supply lines stretched to breaking. Fuel trucks that should have been carrying petrol were now being requisitioned to evacuate wounded men. The orderly flow of replacement parts, ammunition, fresh crews, all of it had evaporated in the space of a few days. Communication between divisional headquarters and individual tank companies became sporadic, then nearly impossible. Radio frequencies crackled with urgent messages, many of them contradictory, some from commanders who no longer existed, their vehicles knocked out or bombed. In the shade of a collapsed farmhouse wall, a radio operator would key his transmitter again and again, calling for permission to withdraw, only to be met with static or silence. The roads into the pocket, particularly the narrow routes that wound through the Norman villages and across the hedgerow country, became scenes of extraordinary congestion. Imagine, if you will, the perspective of a tank commander peering out through his periscope on a summer afternoon in 1944, seeing ahead not kilometers of clear terrain, but instead an ever-thickening mass of vehicles, half-tracks, trucks, motorcycles with sidecars, more tanks, all of them pressing forward or increasingly trying to reverse, to turn, to find any alternative way out. The heat shimmered off the metal, dust rose in great choking clouds, and above, the sound that every German soldier had learned to dread, the distant drone of Allied aircraft engines, growing steadily closer. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies over Poland and France, now appeared almost never. The men on the ground looked up constantly, waiting for fighter bombers, knowing that when they came, the narrow roads would become killing zones. And they did come. The Typhoons and Mustangs, flown by pilots who had learned their trade over weeks and months of combat, would rake the columns with machine gun fire and rockets. A truck loaded with ammunition would explode in a blossom of orange and black smoke. A Panther tank, moments before invincible to ground attack, would shudder under the impact of a rocket strike and tip slowly sideways, flames climbing from the turret. The crews would bail out, running toward the edges of the road, toward ditches and hedgerows, away from their burning vehicles. Some would be wounded, some would not survive the fall. The discipline that the SS Panzer Divisions had been founded upon began to crack under the weight of this pressure. It had not happened all at once, but rather in 1,000 small failures of command and control. Divisions that had fought as unified formations found themselves splitting into regimental columns, then into company-sized groups, then into scattered vehicles moving on their own, their crews following whatever officer seemed most confident about which road might lead west, might lead to safety. A divisional commander trying to maintain cohesion would find that his chief of staff was at the wrong location, that a regiment had become separated, that no one was entirely certain where the main body of the division actually was. The fog of war, which military theorists had written about in peacetime, became a choking, suffocating reality. The SS divisions, products of years of ideological indoctrination and rigorous training, were discovering something that no amount of propaganda had prepared them for, that desperation unmakes discipline, not among all men, certainly. There were still panzer crewmen who maintained their formations, still officers who shouted orders and expected them to be obeyed, but the old certainty, the sense that the SS Panzer arm was an instrument of invincible will, had evaporated as completely as the morning mist over the Norman fields. In the villages around Chambois and Trun, German soldiers began to dig in, establishing defensive positions to hold the roads open, to buy time for more vehicles to escape. But there were never enough men, never enough ammunition, Never enough daylight. The Americans pressed from the south, the Canadians and Poles from the north. Each day the pocket grew smaller, the roads narrower, the congestion worse. Tank crews, spotting a column ahead of them, would attempt to maneuver around it, leaving the roads, crushing through hedgerows and farm fences, sometimes overturning in the process. Imagine the peculiar horror of being inside a tank that tips over, the disorientation, the awareness that escape is becoming difficult, that the weight of machinery is settling down on top of you. The destruction accumulated. Burned-out vehicles lined the roads. Some still smoldered for hours after being hit. Others had been abandoned, their crews having fled into the countryside, hoping to make their way west on foot. The landscape became a graveyard of metal and rubber and twisted metal tracks. A Panzer IV, its turret blown clean off, sat tilted in a ditch like a monument to some absent god. A half-track lay on its side, its cargo of supplies spilled across a field. Motorcycles, small and fragile, were scattered about like toys abandoned by a careless child. The human cost was equally staggering, though it was harder to measure, harder to quantify. Men died in the vehicles. Men died trying to escape them. Men died in the hedgerows, caught in crossfire between advancing Allies and retreating Germans. The roads became slick, not just with fuel and oil but with blood, with the visceral reminder that this was not a chess game, not a problem to be solved through superior will or better training. It was suffering, pure and absolute, and it was being inflicted on both sides with equal indifference. By the 18th, perhaps the 19th of August, the pocket had become so compressed that the divisions ceased to exist as coherent military units. Headquarters elements found themselves separated from their troops. Regimental commanders could not locate their battalions. Company officers gathered whatever men happened to be nearby and led them toward what they believed to be safety, which was often not safety at all, but merely the next hedgerow, the next ditch, the next temporary defensive position. The magnificent war machine that had rolled into Normandy just over 2 months earlier, that had been the spearhead of German armoured power on the Eastern Front, was coming apart not in one catastrophic moment, but in 1,000 small collapses of order, in an endless accumulation of losses and mistakes and human exhaustion. The pocket had become a prison, and by the middle of August, the men inside it understood with growing clarity that escape was no longer a matter of strategy but survival. The ground itself seemed to have turned against them. Roads that had once connected supply lines and reinforced positions were now arteries of death, watched from above by Allied fighters and raked by artillery positioned on every ridgeline. To remain in place was to be annihilated. To move was to walk into a maelstrom. And yet, the divisions that had been trained for lightning warfare, for breakthrough and maneuver, found themselves gathering what remained of their strength for one last convulsive attempt to break through the tightening Allied cordon. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had come to Falaise with a reputation forged in Russia and hardened through years of intense combat. They were not entirely intact, no division was anymore, but they still commanded a certain pride and cohesion that comes from long-standing units. As the pocket compressed, as the roads became narrower and the artillery fire more intense, the officers of Das Reich made their calculations. They could feel the closing of the trap. They could see the dust clouds of approaching columns to the north and east. The question that occupied their minds in those suffocating hours was not whether they would break out, but how many men and how many tanks they could preserve in the attempt. It was a grim arithmetic, practiced by desperate commanders who understood they were running out of options. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, perhaps the most tragic unit in this entire narrative, was in even worse condition. They had been the pride of the Hitler Youth movement, recruited from among the most politically committed young men in Germany, trained to be the vanguard of a new age. Instead, they had been thrown into the hedgerows of Normandy and ground down by a superior enemy with unlimited ammunition and complete command of the air. Their losses had been catastrophic. By mid-August, the Hitlerjugend was not truly a division anymore, but a collection of scattered companies and platoons, many of them commanded by junior officers or even senior enlisted men whose commanders had been killed in action. Yet somehow, these young soldiers still possessed the will to fight, the determination to escape, and perhaps something deeper, the desperate hope that if they could only make it out of this pocket, the war might somehow continue, or that they might simply survive to see another day. The breakout attempts were not coordinated in any grand sense. There was no master plan, no comprehensive assault on the perimeter. Instead, what developed over several days was a series of desperate, fragmented efforts. Small battle groups, a few tanks here, a handful of armored personnel carriers there, clusters of infantry on foot, would suddenly attempt to punch through the Allied lines at points where they perceived weakness, or where the fire seemed momentarily to slacken. Some of these attempts were made during daylight, which was suicidal and born of sheer desperation. Others waited for darkness, hoping that the cover of night and the confusion of movement might provide just enough cover to slip through. The men of Das Reich mounted perhaps their most serious effort through the eastern side of the pocket, toward the towns of Chambois and Troon, where Polish and Canadian forces were attempting to close the final gaps. These were difficult terrain, rolling bocage interspersed with stone walls and small villages, places where tanks could not move freely and where the defending units, though numerous, were also somewhat dispersed. The German commanders gathered what they had: a few Panther tanks, some assault guns mounted on tank chassis, half-tracks, trucks carrying riflemen. They gathered also what remained of their unit's ammunition and fuel, and they attempted to force their way through. What made these breakout attempts so agonizing was the element of mutual exhaustion. The Allied forces surrounding the pocket were themselves battered and tired. They had been fighting continuously for over 2 months. Their supplies, though superior in quantity, were still subject to the logistical constraints of an army operating at the end of a very long supply line. The Canadians and Poles, in particular, were acutely aware that they were racing against time to close the pocket before German units slipped away, and this awareness made them both more aggressive and, in some cases, more prone to gaps in their perimeter where determined soldiers might break through. Yet the imbalance in firepower was absolute and undeniable. The Germans attempting to break out did so without air cover, without any realistic hope of aerial support, while above the pocket, Allied fighters circled like hawks. A Panther tank breaking into open ground would draw fire from anti-tank guns, from riflemen with Panzerfausts, from artillery batteries that had the coordinates of every approach route committed to memory. The Hitlerjugend soldiers, many of them barely 18 or 19 years old, found themselves running across fields in daylight or moving through hedgerows at night, acutely aware that each movement might be their last. Some made it through, many did not. What is striking about accounts of these breakout attempts, pieced together from survivor testimonies and German military records, is the way they reveal the fundamental human response to entrapment. The calculations become simpler when you are being surrounded. Questions about ideology, about the rightness of the cause, about Hitler's leadership, these abstract concerns fade when the immediate problem is whether you will be alive in the next hour. The soldiers attempting to break out were motivated by something far more primal: the desire to live, the instinct to flee when surrounded, the hope that somewhere outside the pocket, the situation might be less desperate. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, despite its losses, did manage to force elements through the gaps in a series of operations that spanned several nights in mid-August. These breakout groups, typically numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, and what made it through was largely whatever could move on its own power or be carried quickly. Tanks that could be moved were prioritized, but many had to be abandoned. The division's supply trains were left behind. Communications equipment, records, much of the infrastructure that made a division a coherent military unit had to be sacrificed. What emerged was a shadow of the Das Reich that had entered Normandy in June, still dangerous, still capable of inflicting casualties, but fundamentally diminished. The Hitlerjugend's situation was more tragic still. With fewer vehicles, less mobility, and lower morale after the sustained pounding they had taken in the Bocage, their breakout attempts were largely on foot. This meant that most of their organic firepower, their heavy weapons, their anti-tank capability, had to be left behind or destroyed to prevent capture. The men who broke out did so as individual soldiers or in small groups, moving through fields at night, swimming across the Dives River, where it served as a barrier, making their way west or north away from the converging Allied forces. Thousands made it out, but thousands more were captured or killed in the attempt. There is something almost dreamlike in the descriptions that survivors have left us of these final days and nights of the pocket. The reports speak of exhaustion so profound that soldiers would sometimes fall asleep in the middle of fields under artillery fire. They speak of the smell of burnt fuel, of diesel and petrol and burnt rubber that seemed to hang in the air constantly. They describe the sounds, the constant rumble of artillery from multiple directions, the distinctive rattle of tank machine guns, the shriek of mortar rounds, the screams of wounded men calling for medics who could not reach them. They describe, too, the moments of relative silence, the inexplicable gaps between barrages when the only sound was the wind moving through the wheat fields and the distant crow of a rooster from some Norman farm that had miraculously survived intact. In those moments of silence, I imagine the soldiers' minds would drift, would wonder about homes they might never see again, about families waiting for letters that might never arrive. The attempts to break out were, from a strictly military perspective, largely unsuccessful in their larger objectives. The SS divisions did not break the pocket. They did not restore the strategic situation. They did not achieve any breakthrough that might lead to the reconstitution of German forces in Normandy. What they did achieve, however, was tactical and personal. They saved some men. They withdrew some of their armor. They inflicted casualties on the Allied forces attempting to contain them. From the perspective of the individual soldier, the significance was absolute. To break out of the pocket meant to live. To fail meant capture, or death, or the terrible in-between of being wounded and left behind. By the middle of August, what had once been a fighting retreat was becoming something altogether different, a vast, chaotic hemorrhaging of an entire army. The roads leading west and north from Falaise, particularly those converging near the small Norman village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, had transformed into something that survivors would struggle to describe with precision for decades afterward. Not quite a battlefield in the traditional sense, something closer to a slaughterhouse arranged by geography and mathematics. The Dives River, winding through chalk-bottomed valleys and hedgerow-lined banks, had become an inadvertent barrier, and on the high ground overlooking the crossings near Saint-Lambert, Canadian and Polish forces had taken positions that commanded nearly every approach. By August 18th and 19th, the volume of German traffic attempting to flow through this bottleneck, tens of thousands of vehicles, horse-drawn guns, personnel carriers, the machinery of a broken army, had created a kind of grinding, desperate compression that would be remembered less as a battle than as an apocalypse made manifest. The shelling began in earnest as dawn broke on the 19th. Artillery concentrations, observed and coordinated by officers who could see nearly everything from the ridges above, poured down onto the roads with what witnesses called industrial precision. Not isolated shells or sporadic fire, but continuous waves of ordnance that turned asphalt and earth into fountains of black smoke and debris. The gunners knew their targets weren't moving far. They were trapped, more or less, and the mathematics of artillery support became simply a question of how much fire could be delivered into a fixed area before the pocket closed entirely. One surviving German officer, a major attached to a mechanized unit trying to extract personnel westward, wrote in what would become a war diary that the sound of that artillery couldn't be adequately captured in words. There was the distant crack of the guns themselves, miles away across the Norman fields. Then the shriek of the shell's passage. Then the impact. Not a discrete explosion, but a series of overlapping detonations that seemed to shake the earth in waves. And underneath it all, the sounds that the shells created in themselves, the whistle of fragmentation, the ring of metal on metal as shrapnel ricocheted off armored vehicles, the strangled sounds that came from men caught in the open. But the artillery, terrible as it was, proved almost secondary to what came from above. As the morning progressed and the clouds lifted, which they often did in the Norman summer, revealing the sky in clarifying blue, Allied fighter bombers began their work. Typhoons, tempests, Mustangs, thunderbolts, wave after wave descended on the roads with methodical purpose. The pilots could see the roads packed with vehicles in a way that no pilot had quite experienced in the previous years of the war. No dispersal, no possibility of dispersal, nowhere to hide in the open farmland. The machine gun fire from the aircraft came first, usually. Tracers cutting down at an angle, snapping and sparking against metal, or punching through canvas and flesh with equal efficiency. Then the rockets. Designed to penetrate armor, they left enormous craters in the asphalt. A single rocket hitting a truck could vaporize everyone aboard it. A column of vehicles, strung out along a road with nowhere to turn, was essentially helpless. Survivors spoke of a particular quality to the sound of those attacks. Not the roar of the engines, though that was present, but the sudden, terrible silence that followed. The aircraft would pass, the firing would stop. For a moment, there was almost a quiet, and then the secondary explosions would begin, as burning vehicles ignited their fuel tanks, ammunition, or supplies. Mushrooms of flame rose above the roads. The smoke, thick and black and suffused with the smell of burning rubber and oil and, though few wanted to speak of this directly, burning flesh, hung in the air and seemed to refuse to dissipate. One question that haunted historians afterward was simple but difficult. How many times did the same roads get attacked? Records suggest that some sections of the main escape routes were bombed by Allied aircraft 5, 6, sometimes 7 times over the course of a single day, as the aircraft rotated through the airfield, rearmed, and came back. The pilots weren't always coordinating perfectly. There was redundancy, undoubtedly, but there was also a kind of relentless efficiency, a determination to prevent as much German material as possible from escaping. The landscape itself began to change under this onslaught. Trees lining the roads were sheared off by blast and fragmentation. Farmhouses near the key crossings were obliterated or turned into roofless shells. The roads themselves became nearly impassable, not from tactical obstruction, but from the sheer density of destroyed vehicles. A Tiger tank that had somehow survived the earlier fighting, broken down or out of fuel, might be lying across one lane. A truck burned down to its axles in another. A horse-drawn gun, overturned, blocking the way forward, and around all of it, the detritus of movement, abandoned rifles, scattered ammunition, personal belongings, the photographs that soldiers had been carrying, now scattered into the dust. The particular horror of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive and the roads in its immediate vicinity began to earn what would eventually be called the Corridor of Death. though this name wouldn't become widespread until after the war. But soldiers who passed through it, or tried to, or who simply witnessed it from defensive positions, knew in the moment that they were witnessing something historically extreme, a concentration of destruction that seemed almost beyond the scale of what warfare typically produced. What made it distinct, or what seemed to make it distinct to those experiencing it, was the sense of inescapability. A soldier caught in normal combat could often move to flanking positions, find cover, retreat under darkness. But here, compressed into a narrow geographic pocket with nowhere to go and surrounded by enemies, the mathematics of survival became deeply mathematical in the truest sense. The odds were objectively poor, and everyone knew it. The Canadian forces holding the high ground above the dives, and the Polish units on other sections of the perimeter, reported that by August 19th, they were simply receiving surrender after surrender, not in an orderly fashion necessarily, often in desperation. German soldiers, some of them screaming, some of them silent, emerged from the smoke with their hands raised. Some were teenagers, conscripted into the Hitlerjugend division only months earlier. Others were hardened SS veterans who had thought themselves invincible through years of Eastern Front fighting. The transition from that belief to the reality of the corridor of death had compressed itself into a matter of hours. What perhaps was most psychologically devastating for the German soldiers caught in this situation was the element of visibility. Unlike the hedgerow fighting of July, where combat had been intimate and confined to small spaces, the Falaise Pocket, and particularly the roads through Saint-Lambert, was a place where soldiers could see their fate approaching. The artillery shells were coming from visible positions on distant ridges. The aircraft were visible approaching from the horizon. The Canadian and Polish troops were visible on the surrounding high ground, and the columns of smoke rising from destroyed vehicles, visible for miles, were a constant reminder of what was happening to those ahead in the column, and what was likely to happen to oneself in turn. By evening of the 19th, something like organized retreat had become impossible. What remained was primarily a series of desperate, fragmented attempts by individual units to break through the encirclement or find some pocket of safety in the shrinking space still available to them. The SS divisions that had entered Normandy with such confidence and destructive power, their armor gleaming, their personnel selected for racial ideology and martial conditioning, were being ground down not by a more powerful single opponent, but by the accumulated weight of every advantage that the Allies possessed. Superior numbers, superior air power, better observation, better coordinated artillery, and time, precious time, to maintain the encirclement and crush it systematically. The corridor of death, as history would know it, was not a place where heroes emerged from rubble to turn the tide of battle. It was something quieter and more absolute than that. It was the place where an army stopped being an army and became instead a collection of desperate, hunted men trying to survive the next few hours. In the summer of 1944, the Norman countryside had become something neither farmer nor soldier had quite bargained for. The very earth that had fed generations had become a calendar, measured not in harvests but in the passage of armies. And as the Falaise Pocket tightened around those trapped SS Panzer Divisions, the people caught in between, those whose surnames were inscribed on gravestones that still stood in quiet churchyards, faced a kind of loss that no uniform could fully explain or contain. The civilians of Normandy had endured the preliminary bombing, the shock of invasion, and then the slow, grinding occupation of their towns and farms by successive waves of soldiers. Many had hidden in cellars as artillery reduced homes to rubble. Others had fled inland, leaving behind orchards and dairy herds, properties their families had tended for centuries. What were they to do when two armies converged upon their land, each fighting with the desperation of the moment? A French farmer near Chambois watched as German columns, many of them young men from the SS Panzer Divisions, some conscripted, others volunteers in a cause they believed in or had been forced to serve, retreated through his fields. Hours later, Allied shells fell in the same place. His barn was gone, the animals were gone, and when he returned after the fighting ceased, he found himself standing in a landscape that bore no resemblance to the one he had left only days before. It is easy, when we speak of military history and the grand strategies of generals, to forget that history was being lived by people for whom victory and defeat were not abstract concepts, but the difference between having a home and having nothing at all. Consider the perspective of those German soldiers trapped in the pocket, many of them conscripted men in their 20s or younger, panzer crewmen who had joined the SS for reasons ranging from genuine ideology to economic necessity to simple lack of choice in a totalitarian state. They had heard the propaganda, they had been trained, and yet, when the walls began closing in, when they realized that retreat was becoming encirclement, and encirclement was becoming annihilation, many of them must have felt a terrible clarity about their own vulnerability. They were, beneath the uniform and the insignia, young men caught in a collapse they could not control and could scarcely comprehend. The soldiers of the Allied forces converging toward Falaise carried their own weight. The Canadian and Polish forces driving down from the north, the American and British columns sweeping from the south and east, they too had endured losses. They too had friends and comrades who would not be walking out of Normandy. And now, as they advanced toward the closing pocket, they faced the knowledge that every yard gained might be bought with another life. There is a peculiar exhaustion that settles over men who know they are close to ending something, who can feel the approaching moment when pursuit becomes rout, when the enemy stops being a distant threat and becomes immediate and desperate and dangerous in new ways. The tighter the noose, the more ferociously those trapped tend to fight, and the soldiers closing that noose knew this too. What happened in those August days was a convergence of suffering that was nearly random in its distribution. A Canadian infantryman from Toronto might be killed by a remnant of the Hitler Youth Division. Children, some of them barely 18, fighting with a fervor born of fanaticism or desperation, or both. A German panzer officer, a career military man with no love for the Nazi regime but bound by oath and circumstance, might be killed by an American artillery shell fired by someone he had never met and could not have harmed. A Norman woman tending her garden in what she hoped might be a moment of relative safety could be caught by stray fire from either side and simply cease to exist. These deaths had no grand meaning. They did not determine the outcome of the battle or the war. They simply happened as part of the terrible arithmetic of war. There is something that historians and veterans speak of when they reflect on Falaise that has less to do with tactics than with the sense of crossing a threshold. The German soldiers retreating through the corridor of death, as it came to be known, were not fighting an ordered rearguard action. They were fleeing, and in that flight, something of the previous aura of the SS Panzer Divisions, that reputation for discipline and ferocity that had preceded them across the Soviet Union, seemed to dissolve. Men abandoned equipment. Officers lost contact with their units. The coherence that had made them formidable as a military force fractured under the pressure of concentrated fire and imminent capture. But this dissolution was also deeply human. They were frightened. They wanted to live. And wanting to live, they became vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with the military capabilities of their opponents, and everything to do with the simple human need for survival. The Norman civilians, meanwhile, emerged slowly from their shelters in the days after the pocket collapsed. What they found was a landscape transformed, not just by the construction of armies, but by loss. Some found their homes standing but their neighbours gone. Others discovered that their homes had simply ceased to exist, reduced to broken stone and ash. The animals in the fields were sometimes still alive and sometimes not. The silence after the guns fell quiet was, witnesses reported, more disquieting than the noise of battle itself. It was a silence that carried within it all the absence. In the months and years that followed, survivors on all sides, German, Allied, French, had to make sense of what they had experienced and witnessed. The soldiers who had been there could not unsee what they had seen. The civilians could not truly rebuild what had been taken, even if new homes were constructed, and new animals raised, and new crops planted. There is something about the experience of warfare passing over your own land that leaves a permanent mark, a kind of scar in the collective memory of a place. The fields of Normandy, peaceful now for generations, still held within them the echo of that August in 1944, not as something to be celebrated or mourned in the abstract, but as something that had touched every living thing in its path. The soldiers too, those who survived, both German and Allied, carried that experience forward. Some found meaning in what they had endured, others never quite made sense of it. The SS Panzer Divisions, or what remained of them, would be reformed and sent eastward and then westward again, and their soldiers would face other battles and other horrors. Many would not come home. Those who did found that home had changed in ways they could not have anticipated, even knowing that they themselves had changed irrevocably. What we might hold in our minds as we contemplate Falaise, then, is not just the grand narrative of military collapse, but the simple, human dimension of what it meant to be caught in that moment. To be a young soldier realizing that the myths you had been taught were not bearing up under the weight of reality. To be a civilian watching your world unmade by forces larger than any individual will. To be among the soldiers closing the trap, knowing that your duty was to kill men you had never met and would never know. These are the true dimensions of Falaise, not in the strategic sense, but in the lived sense, the way that history appears when you strip away the distance and the years and imagine yourself present in the moment. By the morning of August 21st, the organized military structures that had once defined the SS Panzer Divisions had largely ceased to exist within the pocket. Where regiments had once functioned as coherent units with clear chains of command, there now remained only scattered clusters of exhausted men, many of them moving on foot because their vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. The transformation had been so complete, so devastating, that officers found themselves commanding groups of strangers from different divisions, different companies, all flowing together like tributaries into a river with no clear destination. The collapse came not in one dramatic moment, but rather as a series of overlapping surrenders and dispersals through the dark hours of August 20th into the 21st. Some units fought their way out in small groups during the night, moving in silence through the lanes toward the Dives Valley. Others simply laid down their weapons as the dawn broke grey and hopeless, their ammunition exhausted, their will depleted by 5 days of constant bombardment and retreat. A few commanders attempted organized withdrawals, trying to maintain some semblance of military discipline even as the pocket itself was dying. But discipline, that invisible force that had held elite formations together through years of brutal warfare, proved fragile when faced with the knowledge that escape was becoming impossible. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, once the ceremonial guard of the Führer himself, had been reduced to perhaps 2,000 men by this point, scattered across several kilometers of farmland and small roads. The Das Reich division, which had earned such fearsome reputation on the steppes of Russia, was now represented by fragments, survivors clustered around a few remaining half-tracks and personnel carriers. The Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, divisions that had fought with tactical brilliance in the east, existed now only as shadows of their former strength. These were not the triumphant formations that had wheeled and charged across the open plains of Ukraine. These were the remnants, the broken pieces, the ghosts of what had been. The question that moved through every soldier's mind in those final hours was simple but impossible. What happened to all the machines? The answer was written across the landscape in an almost surreal catalogue of destruction. The roads leading out of the pocket had become thoroughfares of devastation, lined on both sides with the skeletal remains of German armour. Tank hulls sat burned and blackened, their turrets blown clean off or twisted at impossible angles. Panther tanks that had seemed invulnerable to so many Allied anti-tank guns lay overturned in ditches, their thick armour plates peeled open like the hide of some monstrous beast. Tigers, those legendary cats of the Eastern Front, rested against hedgerows and farmhouse walls, some still smoking even after days had passed, their engines long since cooled into permanent silence. The sheer scale of mechanical death was almost incomprehensible when one considered the effort it had taken to produce each vehicle. Every Tiger required thousands of man-hours of labour in German factories. Every Panther represented precision engineering and scarce resources flowing from across the Reich. Yet here they lay, dozens upon dozens in some areas, hundreds across the whole pocket. Their utility ended in moments of fire or collision. What do such concentrations of destroyed machinery tell us about the nature of industrial warfare? Perhaps that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome the mathematics of tactical encirclement. When an enemy controls the air and can rain fire from above, the quality of individual weapons becomes secondary to the brutal calculus of numerical superiority and positional advantage. The vehicles themselves bore witness to the manner of their destruction. Some showed the clean, punched holes of anti-tank shells entering from the side or rear where armour was thinnest. Others had been struck so violently that entire sides of their hulls had caved inward. Some bore the scarring of repeated machine gun fire, the bullet strikes pocking the metal in spreading patterns that recorded the final moments before the crew abandoned the vehicle or perished inside. The treads of many tanks had been blown off or shattered, leaving the machines immobilized, transformed from apex predators into stationary targets. A few still had shells and ammunition scattered around them, suggesting that their crews had fought to the last moment before being forced to evacuate or surrender. Around these mechanical graves lay the debris of retreat. Motorcycles lay on their sides, their wheels still turning slowly in the breeze. Half-tracks with their canvas covers torn away revealed cargo that would never reach its destination. Ammunition boxes, supplies, spare parts for engines that would never run again. Trucks sat empty or partially burned, their cargo beds open to the sky like reaching hands. Field kitchens had been abandoned mid-preparation, their stores of food now feeding neither soldiers nor animals, but simply decaying in the August heat. Signal equipment, radios, telephone lines, the entire apparatus of military communication had been scattered and destroyed, each piece a small monument to the dissolution of command and control. The human cost materialized in the form of thousands of prisoners. By the evening of August 21st, the Allies were processing roughly 50,000 German soldiers who had surrendered or been captured in and around the pocket. Among these were thousands of Waffen-SS men, many of them still bearing the ideological conviction that had shaped them even as the military structure containing that conviction had been obliterated. They walked toward captivity in columns, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces marked by exhaustion and the particular shock that comes from the sudden end to organized resistance. Some moved with resignation, others still possessed a kind of dignity in defeat. All were witnesses to a transformation they could scarcely have anticipated just days before. The roads themselves had become almost impassable in places due to the accumulation of wreckage. Engineers had to work through August 21st and beyond, simply clearing lanes wide enough for Allied vehicles to move forward. The smell that rose from the pocket as the heat of the day increased was complex and profoundly unsettling, the acrid burnt metal of destroyed vehicles mixing with diesel fuel and something else, something organic and deeply troubling that no soldier ever wished to identify. It hung over the Falaise region like an invisible presence, settling into uniforms and equipment, marking everyone who passed through with a scent they would carry in their memory for the remainder of their lives. By midnight on August 21st, organized SS Panzer resistance in the pocket had effectively ended. What remained were individual soldiers attempting escape, small groups moving through fields in darkness, and the vast, silent accumulation of destroyed equipment. The formations that had been deemed the elite of the Nazi war machine had been reduced, in the space of 16 days, to a collection of prisoners and scattered fugitives. The pocket itself had ceased to exist in any meaningful military sense. The Falaise Pocket was now, finally, simply a geographical location marked by destruction. A place where, for a brief and terrible moment in history, the military might of Nazi Germany had been concentrated and then systematically dismantled by the coordinated effort of multiple Allied armies working in concert against a trapped and dying enemy. What survives when an army dies? Not the men, though some did return, but the machines that broke beneath them, the memories burned into those who escaped, and the strange, almost hallucinatory need to rebuild what had shattered. The SS Panzer Divisions that limped away from Falaise in late August 1944 were not units anymore, they were fragments. Scattered companies, crews without tanks, officers commanding ghosts of regiments. The Leibstandarte, which had entered Normandy with nearly 200 tanks and 10,000 men, departed with perhaps 40 operational vehicles and 4,000 soldiers, most of them hollow-eyed and moving as though still deafened by the noise of the pocket. The Das Reich division, that storied formation that had terrorized the Eastern Front and carved through the hedgerows with terrible efficiency, lost nearly 3,000 men at Falaise alone. They counted their remaining panthers on one hand. Yet the machinery of war, even defeated war, does not simply stop. Orders came down from above, from a command structure itself fractured and growing more desperate, to regroup, to reconstitute, to prepare for what Hitler believed would be the great counterstroke that would push the Allies back into the sea. Between late August and December 1944, the surviving SS Panzer Divisions underwent a process that might be called ghostly reconstruction. They withdrew east, toward the Reich itself, gathering the walking wounded, the men discharged from hospitals, the fresh conscripts who had never fired a shot in anger, and the replacement tanks that rolled from German factories with ever-diminishing quality. The Hitlerjugend Division, that unit composed of teenage fanatics, rebuilt itself almost entirely. Most of its original members were dead or missing in the Norman earth. The new Hitlerjugend filled its ranks with boys even younger, 16 and 17-year-olds, who joined because they had been taught their entire lives that they were the future of the German race, that the Führer needed them, that death in service was transcendence. But something had changed in the survivors, something that no amount of fresh paint on tank hulls or new uniforms could restore. The men who had lived through Falaise carried with them a knowledge that their enemy could not be beaten. They had seen the endless streams of Allied bombers, the artillery concentrations that could level a town in minutes, the sheer numerical superiority that made their courage seem almost like sacrifice without purpose. Some historians suggest, and it is worth considering carefully, that the SS Panzer Divisions that reformed in autumn 1944 were not truly the elite formations they had once been, not in spirit. The veterans among them had survived through a combination of luck and cunning, and luck, as any soldier knows, is a corrosive thing to depend upon. It makes a man question whether he is preserved for a reason or merely postponed. There exists in accounts from the period a quiet, almost numb quality to the writing of these men, a sense that they were moving through the motions because the alternative was unthinkable, because stopping meant confronting what they had witnessed. The Ardennes offensive, which would be launched in mid-December under the code name Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, placed tremendous weight on these reconstituted divisions. It was to be the great gamble, the surprise attack through the Belgian forests and hills that would, Hitler believed, split the Anglo-American alliance and force a negotiated peace. The SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Sepp Dietrich, a man whose intelligence was frequently questioned but whose personal loyalty to Hitler was absolute, would form the northern prong of the attack. The divisions that had suffered so terribly at Falaise were asked to do it again, to fight with the fury and efficiency they had once possessed. But can a unit that has been broken truly be remade? There is a difference, perhaps, between rebuilding an army's order of battle and rebuilding its will. On paper, the SS Panzer Divisions looked formidable again. The Leibstandarte had been issued new Panther and Tiger tanks, along with the experimental Jagdpanther tank destroyer. The Das Reich had been refitted and reinforced. Even the Hitlerjugend, despite its disturbing youth, was equipped with armor and given offensive objectives. What the records do not fully capture, but what emerges in fragmentary letters and memoirs, is a kind of brittleness in the force. The survivors of Normandy knew things about modern warfare that the replacement troops did not. They knew that courage alone did not stop anti-tank guns. They knew that armor, however thick, could be penetrated. They knew the particular sound of a thunderbolt diving toward your position, the way the earth convulsed when phosphorus shells landed, the smell of burning rubber and diesel and human flesh mingling together in the cold air. Some of them were eager for the Ardennes offensive, believing that a breakthrough might actually change something. Others seemed to approach it with a kind of grim resignation, as though they were actors in a play whose ending they already knew. The psychological weight of what Falaise had done, not just the tactical defeat, but the revelation that their enemy could not be defeated, sat upon them like a stone. They carried it into Belgium. They carried it through the snowy forests. They carried it into every engagement, even the ones where they fought with remarkable tenacity and inflicted serious casualties on the American forces opposing them. It is one of the quieter tragedies of the Second World War, perhaps, that men are asked to rebuild themselves after being shattered, asked to believe in victory after they have felt defeat in their bones. The SS Panzer Divisions that fought in the Ardennes were different creatures than those that had dominated the Eastern Front, or even those that had begun the Normandy campaign with such confidence. They had been burned, quite literally in some cases. Many of the crews had escaped from flaming tanks, and something in that burning had altered them. Not all of them, certainly. There were still fanatics, still men who believed in the Nazi cause with an intensity that is difficult for us to comprehend now. But among the veterans, there was often a knowing sadness, a recognition that they were part of something that had already died at a place in Normandy called Falaise, and that what followed was merely the long, grinding coda to that death. The Ardennes offensive would achieve some initial successes. The German forces would advance further than many had expected, and for a few days in December, there was genuine hope in German headquarters that the strategic gamble might work. But the hope, like so much else in the war's end, would prove to be an illusion. The momentum would be checked. The Allies would regroup and counterattack, and the SS Panzer Divisions, or what remained of them, would find themselves falling back once again, not toward Germany now, but toward the end itself. What makes Falaise different, in the minds of those who study tanks and armies and the shape of wars, is something almost mathematical in its finality. The SS Panzer Divisions had suffered terrible losses before, on the Russian steppes, in the grinding retreats of 1943 and early 1944, in the counteroffensives that drained their fuel and their faith. But Falaise was not loss in the way a campaign is lost, where armies retreat, regroup, and return another day. Falaise was the breaking of a thing that could not be remade in the same way. Consider the numbers, though numbers alone never quite capture what happened. In the pocket, in August 1944, somewhere between 50,000 and 55,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The exact figure will always rest in uncertainty, as these things do in history. The smoke clears, but never completely. Of these, a disproportionate share belonged to the armoured divisions, the Waffen-SS formations that had formed the heart of German panzer strength in the West. They entered Normandy with approximately 900 tanks and assault guns between them. They left the pocket having lost the vast majority, not to be simply replaced. The mathematics of industrial war are cruel and patient. Replacement tanks require factories, fuel, crews with experience. Germany, by late summer 1944, was running short of all three. But the historians who call Falaise the breaking point are not speaking primarily of metal or numbers. They are speaking of something more fragile and harder to count. They are speaking of cohesion, of the organizational spine that holds an army together. The SS Panzer Divisions that fought at Normandy had carried with them an identity forged in years of victory. They had moved through conquered lands, had tested themselves against Soviet armor, had built a reputation that made Allied soldiers wary. That identity was not invulnerable, but it was real. It shaped how officers commanded, how junior soldiers obeyed, how the entire formation moved as one organism rather than scattered parts. Inside the pocket, this cohesion fractured irreparably. Division commanders could not communicate with regiment commanders. Regiment commanders did not know where their companies were. Tank crews fought isolated actions without support. The great formations that had wheeled across the Russian plains in coordinated drives became clusters of desperate men trying to carve escape routes through encircling fire. Officers found that orders could no longer be transmitted down the chain. There was no chain, only chaos. And chaos, in military terms, is death by 1,000 small cuts. You cannot rebuild cohesion as easily as you build a new tank. You cannot manufacture it in a factory in the Rhineland or the Ruhr. It lives in the experience of men moving as one, trusting one another, knowing that the man beside you will not falter. Once it dies, something essential dies with it. The divisions that emerged from the pocket in the weeks after August 21st were, in a strict sense, the same units. They kept their names, their flags, their historical records, but they were not the same animals. They were ghosts of themselves. Some survived with only a few thousand men when they should have had 15,000 or more. Their officer corps had been decimated. Some divisions lost entire regiment-level command structures in the chaos of the breakout. The young men who replaced the dead were often teenagers conscripted into the final convulsions of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. They lacked the training, the experience, the hardened certainty that had made the original SS Panzer formations so formidable. History is not kind to armies that lose the memory of how to be soldiers, and the Panzer Divisions lost that memory at Falaise. Consider what came after, if we wish to understand the shadow cast by those August weeks. These divisions were eventually reformed, resupplied with new tanks, Panthers and Tigers rolling off the production lines in ones and twos, rather than the great conveyor belts of earlier years. By autumn 1944, they were committed to the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, and though they fought with remaining ferocity, there was something absent. The coordinated maneuvers that had once characterized German panzer tactics were muted. The divisions operated more often in smaller packets, reacting rather than initiating. They were remnants pretending to be armies. Some historians, looking at the battle reports and the testimony of surviving officers, have suggested that the Ardennes offensive was less a military campaign than a death rattle, impressive in its violence, but ultimately the convulsion of something already broken. The Western Allies, by contrast, moved through Europe after the Falaise Pocket with increasing momentum. Their armour was not as efficient, their individual tanks not as formidable, but they came in overwhelming numbers. More importantly, they came as coherent organizations. The American, British, and Canadian divisions that poured through the gap at Falaise did so with intact command structures, with supply lines that actually functioned, with the intangible sense that they were moving toward victory rather than away from defeat. The breaking of the SS Panzer Divisions in the pocket was, in a real sense, the breaking of German hopes for the West. What came after was merely the slow confirmation of what had already been decided in those terrible August days. This is why military historians, even those with no emotional investment in the outcome, mark Falaise as a threshold. Before it, Germany still possessed elite armoured forces that could, in theory, turn the tide through some brilliant manoeuvre or counteroffensive. After it, Germany possessed ruins pretending to be divisions. Before it, the outcome of the war in Europe remained, in the minds of the German High Command, in some way contestable. After it, the war was simply being played out to its inevitable conclusion. A historical breaking point is not necessarily the moment of heaviest fighting or greatest casualties. It is the moment at which the fundamental balance of power shifts in a way that cannot be reversed by any single action or decision remaining available to the defeated force. The SS Panzer Divisions would continue to exist on paper until the very end of the war. They would fire guns, lose men, retreat through France and Belgium and into Germany itself. But they would never again be the force that haunted Allied commanders in the early weeks after Normandy. That force was broken at Falaise, in a pocket that closed with methodical, pitiless efficiency, and the memory of that breaking would haunt German officers far more than any mere loss of territory could have done. The ground they lost could theoretically be reclaimed. The confidence, the cohesion, the sense of being an unstoppable elite. These things, once shattered, do not come whole again in time for soldiers to use them. And so, in the long quiet that came after, in the weeks and months that followed that sweltering August of 1944, the Norman countryside began, very slowly, to breathe again. The orchards that had stood for centuries remained standing. The hedgerows, those ancient green walls that had slowed the advance of the greatest armoured forces ever assembled, continued their patient work of dividing field from field. The soil, which had drunk so deeply of oil and ash and blood, grew grass once more. It always does. Time moves differently in places where time has been fractured, and if you were to walk those same roads today, the ones that wind past Falaise and through Chambois, past the little crossroads near Trun and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, you might notice something that speaks very softly to anyone listening. The landscape has no scars visible to the eye. No ruins remain. The Norman farmhouses, so many of them damaged or destroyed, have been rebuilt. Children play in fields that were, not so long ago, impossible to cross. The roads are peaceful now, smooth, unremarkable. And yet, if one pauses, really pauses, there is a presence in that landscape that is difficult to name. It is not haunting exactly. It is something more like remembrance, held in the earth itself. You might find a small memorial, a simple stone or plaque, in a village square or beside a wheat field. These memorials honor not just the German soldiers, the SS Panzer crews, the officers and men who died believing they were invulnerable, but the Canadian tankers who closed the northern gate, the Polish cavalrymen who rode into impossible odds, the American soldiers who fought through exhaustion to complete the encirclement, The British and French soldiers who held their ground when holding ground meant everything. And the Norman civilians. Always the Norman civilians. Families who had been caught between two apocalyptic forces, whose homes became rubble, whose fields became killing grounds, who emerged into that August light to find their world remade into something they barely recognized. The memorials say simple things. They say that people died here. They say that it mattered. And in the present day, on an August afternoon when the light falls the way it did in 1944, golden and long across the fields, there is sometimes a visitor standing at one of those stones, reading a name, thinking about what it meant to be that person in that moment, in that pocket, in those final hours when all the certainties began to collapse. What does it mean, one might wonder in such a place, to have been absolutely certain of your cause, your training, your armor, your superiority, and then to find all of those certainties falling away like leaves? The SS Panzer Divisions never recovered from Falaise, not truly. They were rebuilt, yes. They would fight again in the Ardennes in December 1944, one last desperate gamble in winter snow. But the aura of invincibility that had clung to them in 1943, when they swept across the Eastern Front and seemed almost supernatural in their power, that was gone, shattered in the bocage, broken in the pocket, left behind in the wheat and the dust and the rubble of 100 small French villages. And perhaps that was what mattered most in the end. Not that an army was defeated, many armies have been defeated, but that a mythology was unmade. That certainty itself proved to be fragile, that the landscape of northwestern France, with all its quiet weight of centuries, refused to be conquered, and instead simply absorbed the storm and waited for peace to return. The Norman fields today are very peaceful indeed. If you listen carefully in those fields, truly listen, you might hear something beneath the wind and the distant traffic and the calls of birds. It is not a sound exactly. It is more like a silence that has depth to it, a silence that remembers, a silence that holds the memory of everyone who fell there, regardless of what uniform they wore or what flag they served. And that silence, that deep and patient silence of the earth itself, is perhaps the most fitting monument of all, for it speaks of continuity, of the turning of seasons, of time passing, carrying us all forward into unknowing futures, the way the Norman soil carries forward